The photo arrived at 4:11 p.m. Clara Whitmore was standing at the altar in $3,000 worth of silk and lace, holding a bouquet of white peonies that had already started to wilt in the afternoon heat. When her phone buzzed once inside the hidden pocket, her seamstress had sewn into the dress as a joke. Just in case Elena had laughed. You never know. Clara knew. She pulled the phone out because something cold had already moved through her chest before she even looked at the screen. Some animal part of her brain had already processed what her conscious mind refused to accept. Church was full. 180 people were watching the back doors, waiting for the groom. The string quartet had looped through the same Debussy piece twice. The photo showed Vincent Devereaux with his mouth on her sister's mouth, his hand in Bianca's hair, and Bianca wearing their grandmother's pearl hair comb. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt the floor disappear underneath you, while everything around you stayed perfectly still, the flowers, the candles, the faces of people who loved you, then you already know what happened inside Clara Whitmore's body in that moment. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the bouquet. She just looked at the photo for 4 seconds and understood that the last 3 years of her life had been a performance, and she had been the only person in the cast who didn't know the script. Before we go any further, if this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes, and stay with me because what happens next in this story is something I still can't believe actually happened. Every part of this is going to get worse before it gets better. You don't want to miss what Clara does with that photo. 3 years earlier, Clara Whitmore had not been looking for Vincent Devereaux. That was important because it meant she hadn't been stupid. She hadn't walked into something with her eyes wide open and ignored the warning signs. She'd been at a charity auction for a children's literacy foundation, the kind of event her company sponsored twice a year, unremarkable, forgettable, full of people in expensive clothes making tax-deductible donations when a man sat down beside her and said, "That painting is hideous. Someone's going to spend $40,000 on something that looks like a hotel lobby mistake." She'd laughed. That was the honest truth of it. She'd laughed because he was right, and because nobody in that room had said a true thing all evening, and because he was looking at her like he actually wanted to know what she thought, instead of what she was worth. His name was Vincent Devereaux. She knew the name. Everybody in New York's business world knew the name, the way you knew the names of weather systems, something powerful, something that moved in patterns you could track but never fully predict. The Devereaux family had money that went back 4 generations, the kind of money that had its own gravity, that pulled institutions and politicians into orbit. Vincent himself ran Devereaux Holdings, which was the public face. What Clara understood but chose not to examine too closely was that the public face was exactly that, a face. She wasn't naive. She was 34 years old and had built Whitmore Estates and Hospitality from a single renovation project into a company with 14 properties across 6 states. A sound like green wood splitting. She'd done it by being good at reading people, at understanding what they wanted versus what they needed, at knowing when someone's selling her something versus actually offering something real. She told herself later that she'd read Vincent wrong, that it could happen to anyone. She said it enough times that she almost believed it. The truth was more uncomfortable. She'd seen the edges of who he was and decided the parts she liked were worth the parts she didn't fully understand. That wasn't naivety. That was a choice. And Clara, even in the worst of it, was honest enough with herself to call it what it was. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. The engagement lasted 2 years. 2 years of dinners and travel and meetings with each other's people. 2 years of building something that looked from the outside like a partnership between equals. Vincent was charming when he wanted to be, not in the easy surface level way that made her suspicious, but in the specific way that meant he paid attention. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He sent her articles about design trends he'd read at 6 in the morning because he'd thought of her. She loved him. That was the part that didn't fit cleanly into the story she'd eventually have to tell. She actually loved him. Her younger sister Bianca had been a different kind of problem, the kind that was present long before Vincent arrived. Bianca was 29, beautiful in the way that required maintenance and an audience, and she had grown up understanding one thing with crystalline clarity, that her older sister's shadow was the most comfortable place in the world, as long as you could also step into the light whenever you needed it. Clara had spent their entire childhood and adult life believing that her job was to make space for Bianca. Their mother had said it so many times it had become ambient noise. Clara is the strong one. Clara can handle it. Bianca needs a little more. She'd believed it so completely, she'd never questioned what it cost her to always be the one handling things. Bianca had met Vincent at Clara's company holiday party 2 Decembers ago. Clara remembered watching them talk across the room and feeling something she'd immediately dismissed as petty, a small, sharp awareness that the conversation between them was running a little long, that Vincent was leaning in slightly when he laughed, that Bianca's hand had touched his arm once, twice. In the automatic way, Bianca touched men she found interesting. She'd dismissed it. Vincent was her fiancé. Bianca was her sister. Some thoughts were not worth having. She had been wrong about that, too. The morning of the wedding, Clara had been awake since 4. Not from nerves, exactly more from the way she always responded to significant events with a kind of heightened alertness that felt less like excitement and more like vigilance. She'd sat in the hotel suite with her coffee, while her 2 bridesmaids and her mother moved around her like moons, and she'd gone through the mental inventory she always ran before something important. What could go wrong? What she controlled, what she didn't. She hadn't put Bianca on the list. Bianca was her maid of honor. Bianca had given a toast at the rehearsal dinner the night before that had made their aunt cry, something about how Clara had always been the person who showed her what it meant to keep going. Clara had sat there feeling the specific, complicated warmth of being loved by someone you also, on some level, never fully trusted, and she'd decided that was just sisters. That was just family. The ceremony was at the Hawthorne Estate Conservatory, which Clara had always loved for its light. The afternoon sun came through the glass walls in a way that turned everything slightly gold, and she'd chosen the venue 3 years before she'd even met Vincent, had filed it away as a place she wanted to use someday for something that mattered. She'd walked to the altar at 3:45 and stood there while her bridesmaids arranged themselves, while the music shifted, while the guests settled into the expectant silence that preceded a beginning. She'd held the peonies white, her choice, though Vincent had suggested roses, which she now understood was because he didn't actually know her at all, and she'd waited. 4 minutes, then 8, then 12. The officiant, a man named Gerard, who had done 3 of her friends' weddings, had leaned toward her at the 14-minute mark and said quietly, "Do you want me to check on something?" She'd said no. She'd said she was sure he was just running late. She'd said it with the steady, composed voice she used in business meetings when something was going sideways, and she needed the room to stay calm while she figured it out. At 16 minutes, her phone buzzed. One buzzed, just the one. She'd pulled it out and looked at the screen, and the photo had been right there. No message, no words. Just the image itself. Vincent's mouth on Bianca's mouth, Bianca's hand pressed flat against his chest, and sitting in Bianca's dark hair, their grandmother's pearl hair comb. The one their grandmother had given to their mother. The one their mother had promised Clara would wear on her wedding day. The one Clara had gone to their mother's house 3 months ago to collect, only to find it wasn't there, and their mother had said she didn't know where it was, and Clara had spent a week being quietly hurt by the loss of it. Bianca had taken it, not for herself or not only for herself. She'd taken it to wear in a car with Clara's fiancé on the afternoon of Clara's wedding, and she'd sent Clara the photo herself. Not by accident, not as some automatic mistake. She had opened her phone and selected the image and typed Clara's name and sent it. Clara stood at the altar for another 11 seconds while she processed the specific quality of malice required to do that. To not only do the thing, but to document it and send documentation to the person you were hurting at the precise moment when the hurt would be most total. Then she put the phone back in her pocket. She walked to the officiant. She said very quietly, "I need the microphone for a moment." Gerard looked at her face and did not ask questions. She walked to the center of the altar, where she would have stood to say her vows, and she looked out at 180 faces, people who had flown in from other states, who had bought gifts and written cards, and made reservations at the reception venue, and she said, clearly, and without her voice breaking once, "The wedding is canceled. Vincent Devereaux's is not coming. I'm sorry you made the trip." The room was so quiet she could hear someone's chair creak. She set the bouquet down on the altar, which was not planned, which was just what her hands did. She picked up her train with both hands, and she walked back down the aisle, past the flowers, past the faces, past her mother who was standing up and reaching toward her and saying her name, and she walked through the doors of the Hawthorne Estate Conservatory and into the late afternoon air. Victoria Hale was waiting outside. This was not coincidence. Victoria was her attorney, her oldest friend, a woman who had sent Clara a single text that morning that said, "I'm in the parking lot if you need me," without explaining why. Clara had thought at the time it was just Victoria, being Victoria, cautious and prepared for all contingencies. Now she thought, what did she know? She sat down on the stone steps, still in her dress, and she looked at Victoria, and she said, "How long have you known?" Victoria's face did the thing where it went very still. 2 days. 2 days. I was trying to find out how much of it was real before I brought it to you. I didn't want to. I didn't want to blow up your wedding on a rumor. It wasn't a rumor. No, Victoria said, it wasn't. Clara looked at her hands. The engagement ring was still on her finger, 2.5 carats, platinum setting, the kind of ring that was less a symbol of affection and more a statement of ownership, if you looked at it correctly. She took it off and held it in her palm, and then put it in her dress pocket next to her phone. "Tell me," she said. "All of it." Victoria started talking 2 minutes earlier, when the conservatory doors opened again, and a man Clara had met exactly once, briefly, at an industry conference 6 months ago, walked out and stopped when he saw her sitting on the steps. Roman Callahan was not what you would call a comfortable person to be around. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had lived in it, not handsome. In the arranged way, Vincent was handsome, but the kind of face that had made decisions and lived with them. Clara had spoken to him for about 4 minutes at the conference. He'd been direct in a way that felt almost rude until she realized he was just someone who didn't waste words, and she'd found herself more engaged in those 4 minutes than in most conversations she'd had all year. She had no idea why he was at her wedding. She had not invited him. He looked at her, sitting on the steps in her wedding dress, and he said, without any preamble, without the careful, calculated softness people usually brought to bad news, "I came here to tell you something before the ceremony, and I'm too late. But you need to hear it anyway." "Sit down then," Clara said. He sat. "I've been working on a partnership agreement with your company," he said. "A major one. My team has been doing due diligence for 3 months. 2 weeks ago we found something." Clara waited. Vincent Devereaux has been building a paper trail for the last 18 months. Shell companies, consulting contracts, his name attached to ownership documents for Whitmore Estates hospitality documents that were never supposed to exist. The air in her chest went somewhere. She sat with the absence of it. "He was going to use the marriage," Roman continued. "The moment you signed that certificate, he had the legal structure in place to argue co-ownership. And from co-ownership, he takes everything," Clara said. "He takes everything." She looked out at the parking lot, at the rows of expensive cars belonging to people who'd come to celebrate something that had never been real. The sun was still doing its afternoon thing, still gold indifferent. "My sister," she said, not really to Roman, not really to Victoria, just to the air. "Did he plan that too?" "Yes," Victoria said quietly. "We think Bianca's been involved for at least a year. The lifestyle brand she launched it was funded through Whitmore accounts. Fake consulting invoices. Your signature on documents you never saw." Clara let that land. She let herself feel the full weight of it, not the betrayal from Vincent, which she was already folding into something she could work with, but the specific weight of her sister's participation. Bianca, who she had protected her entire life. Bianca, who had stood at the rehearsal dinner the night before and cried real tears while describing what Clara meant to her. She looked down at the stone steps. There was a small crack running through the second one, maybe an inch long. She stared at it. Okay, she said. Victoria said, Clara. Okay, she said again. Then let's figure out what we have and what we need. Roman Callahan looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, not pity. She registered with relief. Not the careful management of a fragile woman. Something closer to recognition, like he was seeing something he'd expected and was recalibrating around it. Your operations director, he said. Ethan Brooks. He doesn't know. But he should. I'll call him, she said. She was still in her wedding dress. There were guests beginning to filter out of the conservatory behind her. She could hear her mother calling her name from somewhere inside. She called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring and said, Clara, what's happening? I heard. I need you to freeze all external transfers, she said. Right now. Tonight. Don't let anything move until I get back to you. Pause. All of them? All of them. She thought for a second. Especially anything that's gone to Devereaux Holdings or any of its subsidiaries in the last 18 months. Pull the records. Don't delete anything. Don't move anything. Just secure it. Okay, Ethan said. He didn't ask why. This was one of the things she valued most about him. I'm on it. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Her company was still hers. Vincent hadn't married her. The documents existed, but so did the truth. And in Clara's experience, the truth, when handled correctly, was more durable than any forgery. Vincent Devereaux had spent years building an empire on the premise that everything and everyone had a price. He'd looked at Clara Whitmore and seen a target with assets and a blind spot named Bianca, and he'd made his move with the patience and thoroughness of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. He'd made one mistake. He'd sent the photo to the wrong person. Because Clara Whitmore didn't break when she got bad news. She got very, very quiet and she started to plan. And Vincent Devereaux had no idea what was coming. The stone steps of the Hawthorne Estate Conservatory were cold through the silk of Clara's dress, and she was aware of that coldness in the specific, grounding way you become aware of physical discomfort when everything else is too large to hold at once. Roman Callahan had not left. That was the first thing she registered after she hung up with Ethan. Stills was sitting 2 steps below her, his jacket folded across his knee, watching the parking lot with the patient stillness of a man who was used to waiting for things to become clear. Victoria had moved slightly away, her phone pressed to her ear, already working. Clara looked at the back of Roman's head and said, How long have you known? The full timeline. Turned. My compliance team flagged the shell company structure 11 days ago. I spent a week verifying before I moved on it. And you came here today instead of calling me. I tried calling you. He held her gaze. Your assistant told me you were in pre-ceremony preparation and couldn't be disturbed. I drove here because I thought. He stopped, chose different words. I thought if I told you before and I was wrong about any piece of it, I would have destroyed your wedding for nothing. I was trying to be certain. You were 11 days certain, Clara said. You waited 11 days. He didn't look away. Yes. She held that for a moment. The honest thing about Roman Callahan, she was already understanding, was that he didn't dress things up. He'd made a calculation. The calculation had been wrong in its timing, and he was sitting here on her wedding steps without pretending otherwise. Didn't make her feel better, but it was something she could work with. The documents, she said, the ownership transfer structure. Do you have copies? My legal team does. They're already packaged. I need them tonight. You'll have them within the hour. Victoria appeared at Clara's shoulder, phone lowered. Her voice was tight in the way that meant she was controlling something larger underneath. He's here, Clara went still. Where parking lot? East entrance, he just pulled in. Clara did not turn around immediately. She sat for exactly 3 more seconds, breathing through her nose, feeling the cold of the stone and the weight of the dress and the ring-shaped absence on her left hand. Then she stood. Roman stood with her automatically, and she glanced at him and said, Stay here. Not a request. He stayed. She walked around the side of the conservatory with Victoria beside her. and she saw the car first, a black Escalade, idling near the east gate, the kind of car that announced itself through size and tint and the particular arrogance of taking up space without apology. Then the door opened and Vincent Devereaux stepped out. He was still in his wedding suit. That was the thing she noticed first, which was strange that he'd kept the suit on, as if some part of him had maintained the performance even after abandoning the stage. He was 43, dark-haired, with the kind of physical authority that came from years of being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. He scanned the area and found Clara, and his face did something complicated. Not guilt. That would have been readable. Would have given her something to work with. It was more like reassessment, like a man recalculating. Clara. His voice was the same voice. That was the thing about people like Vincent. The voice didn't change when the mask came off, because the voice was always part of the structure, always something deployed rather than felt. Vincent. She stopped 10 feet from him and did not close the distance. He spread his hands, a gesture she'd seen him use in business meetings, expansive, disarming. I know how this looks. Do you? Let me explain. I don't need an explanation, she said. I have the photo. I have the documents. I have 11 days of compliance records from Roman Callahan's legal team, and I have 18 months of financial transfers out of my company accounts. She watched his face. What exactly were you planning to explain? The hands dropped. The reassessment deepened. He looked at her with something that might have been, for the first time in their 3-year history, actual respect, the kind that came from realizing you'd underestimated someone and were now paying for it. You've been busy, he said. I've been sitting on your steps for 40 minutes, she said. You've been busy for 18 months, Clara. His voice shifted lower, more private, reaching for the register he used when it was just the two of them, when he wanted her to feel that the world outside didn't apply. What happened with Bianca, that was a mistake. It was a mistake I made, and I own it. But the rest of this, what you think you've found. I didn't think I found anything. Ethan found it. Victoria found it. Roman Callahan's compliance department found it. She tilted her head. You put my signature on documents I never saw, Vincent. You moved my company's money through fake consulting invoices. You built a legal structure that would have given you control of everything I owned the moment I became your wife. She paused. Which of those would you like to explain first? His jaw tightened. Just slightly. The only tell he had, and she'd learned it 2 years in. Where did you get that information? Does it matter? Callahan. The word landed flat and cold. You talked to Roman Callahan. He came to me. Clara. And now the voice changed again, not softer, harder, the edge that appeared when he stopped trying to manage something and started deciding how to contain it. Roman Callahan is not someone you want advising you right now. He has his own interests. He has reasons to want to damage me that have nothing to do with you. I'm sure he does, she said. And I have reasons to damage you that have everything to do with me. So at least we'll make a thorough job of it. She turned and walked back toward the front of the building. He said behind her, Don't do something you can't undo. She stopped. She turned back around, just her head, and she looked at him, standing there in his wedding suit, in an empty parking lot. And she said, That's excellent advice, Vincent. I wish you'd taken it. She walked away and did not look back. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that don't feel real while they're happening. Clara changed out of her dress in a bathroom at the back of the conservatory, pulling on the plain clothes Victoria had in her car jeans, a gray sweater, the kind of thing you wore when you needed to stop being a symbol and start being functional. The wedding dress went into a garment bag. She did not look at it again. Roman's legal team sent the documents to Victoria's secure server at 6:48 p.m. Clara sat at a table in the conservatory's back office, a small room used for vendor coordination, still smelling faintly of florist arrangements with Victoria and Roman on either side of her and printed pages spread across the table like a map of something she'd been standing in without knowing it. Walk me through the structure, Clara said. Victoria pointed. He started here. 18 months ago, a consulting agreement between Whitmore Estates and a company called Meridian Advisory Partners. On paper, Meridian advises on property acquisition strategy. In reality, Meridian is a Delaware shell with no employees, no office address, and a registered agent who also handles 12 other Devereaux-adjacent companies. How much went through? To Meridian alone, $2.3 million over 14 months. Clara kept her face even. $2.3 million. She'd had line items that size, and they'd gone through her quarterly review, and she'd signed off on them, and the description had said, Strategic Consulting Property Acquisition, and she'd been building a company in 6 states simultaneously, and she hadn't dug into every line because she'd trusted her CFO, who she now needed to have a very different kind of conversation with. Marcus, she said. Victoria nodded. Your CFO is either complicit or negligent. We don't know which yet. Find out tonight. Working on it. Roman said there's more. He pulled a page from the stack. 3 months ago, a document was filed with the New York Secretary of State's office, amending the operating agreement for Whitmore Estates and Hospitality. The amendment adds a co-managing member. He turned the page to face her. The signature at the bottom was hers. She looked at it for a long time. Her signature, her name, the date March 14th, which had been a Thursday, which she remembered because she'd been in Charlotte that week for the opening of her 8th property. And she'd been exhausted and exhilarated, and she had definitely not been in New York signing operating agreements. He forged it, she said. Yes. And the notary? The notary is a woman named Patricia Sloan, who has notarized 11 documents for Devereaux's entities in the last 2 years. She's going to have a problem. Roman said it neutrally, without relish, just fact. Ethan arrived at 7:30. He knocked twice on the door and came in and stopped when he saw the table covered in documents and Clara sitting there in jeans and a gray sweater with her hair still pinned up from the wedding because she hadn't had time to take it down. He was 52, broad, methodical. The kind of man who had worked for Clara for 6 years without drama because he was constitutionally incapable of drama. He processed things slowly and accurately, and he almost never spoke without having thought first. He looked at the table. He looked at Clara. He said, Tell me where to start. The consulting invoices, she said. All of them. Cross-reference against our legitimate vendor contracts. I want to know every payment that went out without a real service attached. He sat down and opened his laptop. I already started when you called. I've got 14 invoices flagged so far, and I'm not done. How much? Rough total right now, $3.8 million. He stopped, glanced at Roman, whom he didn't know, looked back at Clara. There are also transfers I can't account for that went to something called Whitmore Creative Ventures. That's not one of our subsidiaries. Clara went still. Say that again. Whitmore Creative Ventures. He typed something. It's a brand entity. Luxury lifestyle. They have an Instagram. He stopped again. His expression went careful, the way people's expressions went when they were about to say something they didn't want to say. The creative director is listed as Bianca Whitmore. The room was quiet. Victoria said softly, Clara. Clara stared at the laptop screen, at the logo for Whitmore Creative Ventures, clean, modern, serif font, the kind of thing that looked effortless and cost real money, and she felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but lived in the territory between them. Bianca had a brand, built with her money, using a name that was their name, their family name, the name Clara, had spent a decade making mean something in the hospitality industry. Using her money and her name, and also taking her fiancé, and also taking her grandmother's pearl hair comb, and also sending the photo. All of it at once, all of it deliberate. How much went to Bianca's company? Clara said. Ethan, $900,000, over 8 months. She put both hands flat on the table, breathed once. Okay, she said. I want the full financial forensic report by tomorrow morning. Everything. I want receipts, wire confirmations, the original invoice documents, all of it secured and backed up off-site. Done, Ethan said. She looked at Victoria. Can we move to freeze the operating agreement amendment? Emergency injunction. I can file tonight. Get a judge first thing tomorrow. Do it. She looked at Roman. The partnership agreement between your company and mine, the one you were evaluating. Is it still on the table? He held her eyes. Depends on what you need. I need it on the table. I need it visible. If Vincent sees that Callahan International is moving forward with Whitmore Estates, it signals that his damage to my company's reputation didn't work. It protects my investors from the narrative he's going to start pushing. Roman was quiet for a moment. You're thinking 3 steps ahead. I'm thinking 6 steps ahead, she said. Are you in or not? I'm in, he said. At 9:15, her phone rang. Bianca. She let it ring twice, which was long enough to make a decision. Then she answered and said nothing. Bianca's voice came through tight and high-pitched, the voice she used when she was frightened, but trying to sound like she wasn't. Clara, before you say anything, I'm not going to say anything, Clara said. I'm going to listen. Silence. Bianca was not used to being listened to by Clara. Their dynamic had always been the other way around. I need you to understand that it didn't start the way it looks. How did it start? Vincent approached me a year ago. He said he needed someone to be the public face of a new project, a lifestyle brand, and he thought I would be. She stopped. He paid for everything. The studio, the equipment, the social media team. He said it was an investment. In you. In the brand. Using my company's money. The silence that followed had a different texture. More careful. I didn't know where the money came from. Not at first. And then you did know, Clara said. And you kept the money. Clara, and you kept Vincent. It wasn't. We didn't mean for it to become. Her voice was so level it didn't even sound like her own. You put on grandmother's hair comb and got in his car on my wedding day, and you sent me the photo yourself. She paused. Tell me what part of that wasn't deliberate. Nothing. That's what I thought, Clara said. She hung up. Victoria was watching her. You okay? No, Clara said simply. Keep working. By midnight, they had the outline of what they were dealing with, the shell company structure, the forged amendment, the fake consulting contracts, the $900,000 funneled to Bianca's brand, and the compliance framework Roman's team had already begun documenting for potential regulatory referral. It was enough. It was more than enough. What they didn't have yet was the full picture of how far Vincent's influence extended, how many investors he'd already reached, how many conversations he'd already had preparing people for a version of events in which Clara was the unstable one, the paranoid one, the woman who'd destroyed her own wedding over a misunderstanding. That version of events started appearing the next morning. Clara was at her office at 7 a.m., still running on the kind of alert exhaustion that had no bottom, when her assistant knocked and said, There's something's on page 6. Page 6, the gossip engine of New York's business and social world, where information was currency and rumor and fact were packaged identically and distributed to the same audience. The item was small 4 paragraphs, buried in the middle of the page, but it landed like a needle. Sources close to Vincent Devereaux say the canceled Whitmore-Devereaux wedding was the result of what one attendee describes as a sudden emotional breakdown by the bride, Clara Whitmore. Friends of the couple expressed concern that Ms. Whitmore, under significant pressure from a recent rapid expansion of her company, may have misinterpreted private communications in a way that led to the public cancellation. Devereaux, respected head of Devereaux's Holdings, has declined to comment publicly out of respect for Ms. Whitmore's privacy. Clara read it twice. The language was surgical. Emotional breakdown. Misinterpreted concern. All the words that meant, she's not well, she's not reliable. Don't take her account of events seriously. Vincent had moved fast. He'd had this ready, or close to it, which meant he'd anticipated she might expose him and had prepared his counter-narrative in advance. She set the printout down and picked up her coffee and thought about what it meant that he'd anticipated her, but still underestimated her. Her phone started ringing at 7:45. Investors. 3 in the first hour, then 2 more, then a board member named Gerald Fitch, who had been on her company's advisory board for 4 years and who called himself her mentor, and who said, carefully, the way men said careful things to women they'd decided, were fragile. Clara, I've been hearing some things. I think we need to talk about whether a leadership transition might be appropriate given Zinman's. Gerald, she said, the circumstances and the perception issues that might. Gerald, firmer. He stopped. I'm going to send you a document in the next 24 hours, she said. I'd recommend you read it before you finish that sentence. She hung up. Called Roman. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been expecting her call, which meant he'd seen the page 6 item too. How bad is your investor communication situation? She asked. Stable, he said. My team got ahead of it last night. But mine is rattled. I need the partnership announcement accelerated. Today if possible. I can do a joint statement by noon. Do it. She was still on the phone with Roman's communications director at 10 a.m. when Victoria walked into her office without knocking, which Victoria only did when something had broken in a new direction. Clara looked up. Vincent filed a motion this morning, Victoria said. He's claiming the operating agreement amendment is valid. He's petitioning for access to company financial records as a co-managing member. Clara lowered the phone. He's moving forward. He's not just moving forward, he's accelerating. He filed at 8 this morning, which means he had this ready too. Victoria set the document on Clara's desk. He knew you'd freeze the amendment. He prepared a legal counter before you even made the move. Clara looked at the filing. Vincent Devereaux's attorney's name at the top. The language was clean and confident, the language of someone who expected to win. She thought about him standing in the parking lot the night before in his wedding suit, saying, "Don't do something you can't undo." She thought about the way he'd looked at her, not like a man who'd been caught, but like a man who was still deciding whether to let the game continue. He wasn't scared of her. He was still playing. What do we need to counter it? Clara said. The original signature records. If we can prove the March 14th amendment signature is forged. I was in Charlotte on March 14th. I have hotel receipts, meeting calendars, 3 witnesses who had dinner with me that evening. Then we have a forgery case. File it. Victoria hesitated. 1 second, Clara, when we file the forgery case, this goes from a civil dispute to a criminal matter. That changes everything. His legal team is going to get very aggressive. I know what he's going to do, Clara said. He's going to come at me harder and faster, and he's going to try to make me feel like there's still a version of this where I back down. She looked at Victoria directly. File it. The forgery filing went in at 1:47 p.m. At 2:30, Clara's head of security, a former federal agent named Dennis Park, called to let her know that 2 men had been observing the building's entrance since 10 a.m. Not doing anything, just watching. Dennis described them with the careful, factual precision of someone who'd spent 20 years noting things without reacting to them, and Clara listened and said, "Document everything. Don't engage." She put down the phone and sat for a moment with the specific understanding that Vincent Devereaux was not just a man who had wronged her. He was a man with resources and patience and a willingness to apply pressure in directions that didn't show up in courtrooms. She called Dennis back and said, "I want security on Ethan Brooks and Victoria Hale." Not obvious, just present. At 4 p.m., Marcus Chen, her CFO, requested an urgent meeting. Marcus had been with her company for 5 years. He was 55, methodical, the kind of CFO who wore the same 3 suits in rotation and brought his own lunch, and had never once in 5 years given her a reason for concern. She'd trusted him the way you trusted infrastructure, not actively, just as a baseline assumption. He walked into her office and sat down and put his hands on his knees and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who had something to confess and was deciding whether the confession was worth the cost. She decided to help him. "How much did he pay you?" she said. Marcus closed his eyes. "He didn't pay me." "Then what?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then he has photographs. From 4 years ago. Before I worked here." His hands pressed harder into his knees. "My son was in trouble. Legal trouble. Vincent Devereaux made the legal trouble disappear. And he kept the documentation that proved it existed." Clara absorbed this. "So you've been under his thumb for 5 years." "I've been trying to protect my son." by helping a man steal from my company. Marcus didn't answer. There was no answer. I need everything, Clara said. Every transaction you processed for him, every instruction you received, every email and message. All of it. Tonight. She let the silence sit for a moment. If you cooperate fully, I'll keep your involvement as quiet as the investigation allows. That's all I can offer. And my son? That's not something I can fix, she said quietly. I'm sorry, he nodded once. He stood up. He walked out. She sat alone in her office for exactly 4 minutes after he left, which was all the time she allowed herself. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle, the same gold it had been coming through the glass walls of the Hawthorne Estate Conservatory the day before, when she'd been standing at an altar holding wilting peonies. 28 hours ago, she had been getting married. She picked up her phone and called Roman. He has people watching my building, she said. Roman said, I know. Mine too, she processed that. He's watching both of us. He's decided we're working together. We are working together. Clara. A beat. There's something else. I got a call an hour ago from one of my board members. He was approached by someone from Vincent's network last night, told that the Callahan-Whitmore partnership would expose my company to significant legal liability because Whitmore Estates is under investigation for financial irregularities. He paused. He's running the same play on my investors that he's running on yours, except he's framing it as a warning about you. She thought about that, about the specific efficiency of it. Vincent wasn't just attacking her on her own ground. He was using Roman's network against Roman, trying to isolate her from the one alliance strong enough to hold weight against him. Can your board hold? She said. Yes. But it's going to take pressure. I need 3 days, she said. Give me 3 days. What happens in 3 days? The forensic accounting is done. Victoria files the full case, and I make sure every document Vincent doesn't want seen is in the hands of people who can do something with it. Roman was quiet for a moment. She heard him thinking not literally, but the texture of the silence on his end had a quality of calculation she'd come to recognize in the past 18 hours as distinctly his. All right, he said. 3 days. She hung up and looked at the window and thought about Vincent's face in the parking lot, the reassessment, the recalibration. And she understood with complete clarity that he was moving faster now because he was starting to be afraid. And a frightened Vincent Devereaux she knew was more dangerous than a comfortable one. The call came at 11:47 p.m. when Clara was still at her desk, still working, her 4th cup of coffee cold beside her laptop. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Then something made her pick up. The voice was female, young, shaking in the specific way that meant the shaking was being actively controlled and not quite winning. Ms. Whitmore, my name is Dana Sloan. Patricia Sloan is my mother. She notarized the documents. A pause. She didn't know what she was signing. He told her it was routine business paperwork. She found out tonight what it actually was, and another pause. She wants to talk to your lawyer. She wants to tell her what she knows. Clara sat up straight. Does she know who else was involved? Beyond the documents I already know about? Dana Sloan's voice dropped. She says she notarized 14 documents total. Not 3, 14. 11 documents Clara didn't know about yet. Vincent had been building this for longer than 18 months, and deeper than she'd understood, and whatever those 11 documents contained was either already deployed or waiting to be used. And Clara was sitting in her office at midnight realizing that what she'd found so far was not the whole thing. It wasn't even close to the whole thing. Patricia Sloan arrived at Victoria's office at 7:15 the following morning with her daughter Dana beside her and a manila envelope held against her chest, like something she was afraid someone would take from her before she was ready to give it up. Clara was already there. She'd slept 3 hours on the couch in her office, had showered in the building's gym, and was on her second coffee when Victoria texted to say the Sloans were coming up. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who hadn't stopped moving since her own wedding fell apart 40 hours ago, held together by coffee and the specific forward momentum of someone who understood that stopping would cost more than continuing. Patricia Sloan was 61, small, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and was now just tired. She sat down across from Clara and Victoria and put the envelope on the table and kept her hand off an expression. That was an expression such that was part apology and part the naked, drip-down look of someone who had run out of room to pretend. "I need you to understand," Patricia said, "that I notarized what he told me were standard business documents. For the first 6-8, I had no reason to question it. He paid well. He was always—" She stopped. "He was always very calm about it. Like it was nothing." "When did you start to understand it wasn't nothing?" Victoria said. Document 9. Patricia's hand pressed harder on the envelope. "He brought me something that listed an ownership percentage transfer. I asked him what it was, and he said it was a restructuring document. Internal, routine. And I almost didn't sign it. Something felt—" She shook her head. "But I signed it. Because by then I understood what happened to people who made his business difficult." "What happened?" Clara said. Patricia looked at her directly. "Colleague of mine, a notary out of Queens. He refused to notarize something for one of Vincent's people about 3 years ago. Said it looked irregular. 2 weeks later, he lost his license. The complaint against him was fabricated. We all knew it, but nobody could prove it. He never got it back." She paused. "I have a daughter. I have a practice I've spent 30 years building." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. She understood the calculation Patricia Sloan had kept making, month after month, document after document, and she understood how that kind of fear worked, how it didn't announce itself as fear but as practicality, as reasonable caution. Until one day you looked up and realized you'd been walking in someone else's cage for so long you'd forgotten the walls were there. "What's in the envelope?" Clara said. Patricia opened it. She laid 14 documents on the table in chronological order, each one notarized with her seal, each one bearing Clara's forged signature or Vincent's actual signature or both. Victoria began photographing each page immediately with her phone. Clara leaned forward and looked at them, one by one, without touching them. The first 4 were what she'd already known: the consulting agreements, the operating amendment, the shell company filings. The next 3 were what Ethan had been piecing together. Overnight, the Whitmore Creative Ventures setup documents, additional fund routing structures, a vendor agreement that had never existed. Document 8 stopped her. It was a property deed. A transfer of ownership for a building. She recognized immediately the Whitmore Charleston, her third property, the one she'd spent 14 months restoring, the one that had been on the cover of Architectural Digest 18 months ago. The deed transferred 51% of ownership interest to a company called D.H. Charleston, LLC. She did not need to look up what D.H. stood for. "He took Charleston," she said. Victoria looked up from her phone. Her expression did the thing where it meant what she was looking at was bad enough that she needed a moment before she could respond professionally. "This was filed," Victoria said, checking something on her laptop. "This was filed with the Charleston County Register of Deeds 7 months ago. And nobody flagged it? The filing is in your name." The signature. Victoria enlarged her screen and turned it to face Clara. The signature was precise. It was Clara's name in Clara's handwriting, the particular way she formed the W and the slight backward lean on the H. "He had someone practice this," Victoria said quietly. "This isn't a quick copy. Someone studied your signature." Clara looked at it for a long time. 7 months ago, she'd been in the middle of her Nashville expansion, working 18-hour days, traveling 3 weeks out of 4. 7 months ago, she'd been planning her wedding. 7 months ago, she understood now, perfectly distracted. Documents 9 through 12 were variations on the same structure, partial ownership interests in 4 more properties, each one filed months apart. Each one under the radar of her normal operations, because they'd been filed in jurisdictions where her legal oversight was thinner, where the local attorneys doing the registration work were not people she'd chosen directly. Counted the properties. 6 total. 6 of her 14 locations with compromised ownership on paper. She sat back. Document 13 was different. It wasn't a property transfer. It was a management agreement between Whitmore Estates and Hospitality and a company called Meridian Advisory Partners. The same shell company from the consulting invoices, except this agreement wasn't for consulting. This agreement gave Meridian the right to appoint 2 members to Whitmore's operating management in the event that the company's primary managing member became incapacitated, legally compromised, or voluntarily withdrew. She read that language 3 times. He built a trigger, she said. Victoria nodded slowly. If anything happened to you legally, medically, or if you stepped back voluntarily, Meridian could walk 2 people into your management structure with the authority to run the company. And Meridian is Vincent. Document 14 was a letter. Not a legal document, a letter. Handwritten on plain paper in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Addressed to no one. Signed at the bottom by a name she'd heard exactly once. A city councilman who sat on the zoning committee that controlled development permits for 3 of her New York properties. The letter referenced a dinner, a conversation, an understanding reached. It referenced Whitmore Estates specifically. It referenced the upcoming permit renewals for the Whitmore Midtown and Whitmore Brooklyn, which were scheduled for review in 4 months. He got to the zoning board, Clara said. At minimum 1 member, Victoria said. This letter alone means my New York expansion is contingent on Vincent's goodwill. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. New York was doing its morning thing outside, dense, relentless, indifferent. She stared at it. How long has he had this in place? The letter is dated 11 months ago. 11 months ago, she'd been picking wedding venues. 11 months ago, she'd been having conversations with Vincent about what kind of flowers she wanted at the reception. She turned around. Patricia, she said, I need you to provide a full sworn statement to Victoria today. Every document, every instruction he gave you, every time he told you what to say if anyone asked. All of it. Patricia nodded. Her hand was shaking slightly, just the right one, and she pressed it flat against her knee. And you need to understand, Clara continued, that when this becomes a formal investigation, which it will, your cooperation is going to matter to how you come through it. I understand, Patricia said quietly. Dana, who had not spoken since they'd arrived, said, will she be safe? If Vincent finds out, she talked to you. I'm going to make sure of that, Clara said. She said it because it was the thing that needed to be said and because she intended to keep it. Then she looked at Victoria. Get her and her daughter somewhere else. Today, Victoria was already on the phone. Clara called Ethan from the hallway. The Charleston property, she said. I need you to pull every filing from the Charleston County Register going back 2 years. And Nashville, and the 2 Austin locations. Do it now, before he has a chance to. Already on it, Ethan said, and she could hear the sound of his keyboard, the particular rhythm of it that meant he'd been at this for hours. I found Nashville last night. I was going to call you at 7. What's the damage in Nashville? 40% ownership interest transferred to a DH entity 9 months ago. Same structure. And you didn't see it coming through the accounts? A pause. The kind that meant he'd been sitting with this and knew what she was really asking. Transfers were structured as loan repayments, Ethan said. On paper, Whitmore Estates owed money to these entities for services previously rendered. The loan repayments triggered equity transfers as settlement. It looked like we were paying down debt. We were paying down debt that didn't exist. With equity we didn't know we were giving. She pressed her back against the hallway wall. The morning foot traffic of the office moved past her staff, arriving for a day that looked normal to them from the outside. People with coffee cups and laptop bags who didn't know yet what was sitting underneath the surface of the company they worked for. Ethan, she said, how many properties are clean? A longer pause. I need another 6 hours to be certain. Best estimate right now. 7, maybe 8. Definitely not more than 8. 6 to 7 of her 14 properties had compromised ownership. Half her company, half of what she'd spent a decade building, had been quietly, methodically transferred into Vincent Devereaux's hands while she'd been planning her wedding and expanding her portfolio and believing that the man she slept beside was the man she thought she knew. She went back into the conference room and picked up her coffee and drank the rest of it cold. Roman arrived at 9. He didn't call first, he just appeared, which she was beginning to understand was his way, the way of a man who communicated through presence rather than notification. He walked into the conference room, looked at the document still spread across the table, and looked at Clara. "You found more," he said. 6 properties. Maybe 7. She watched his face process that. He had the particular quality of absorbing bad information without visibly reacting to it, not the forced calm of someone suppressing a response, but the genuine steadiness of someone who'd sat with bad information before and knew that reacting immediately was rarely useful. "The zoning board," he said. "Councilman, you already knew. We found a reference in a financial record. We weren't sure of the scope." He sat down. "The permit renewals for Midtown and Brooklyn are in 4 months. I know, if he controls the zoning. I know, Roman." He stopped, looked at her. "What do you need?" "I need to know which of the 14 documents I can challenge successfully, which properties I can recover, and which fight I should pick first." She sat down across from him. "Because right now I'm looking at 6 fights, and I can only win 3 of them if I try to run them all simultaneously." "Which 3? The forgery case is the cleanest. I have the alibi. I have Patricia Sloane's testimony. I have the signature analysis. Victoria is running this morning. That one I can win." She ticked them off. "The operating amendment also reversible. My original agreement is clear. The Charleston property deed, I need a real estate attorney in South Carolina, but the forgery chain is the same. Same notary, same method. That's 3. The management trigger agreement, the zoning board situation, and the partial interests in Nashville and Austin, those are dirtier. Those require more time, more resources, and Vincent is going to fight them harder, because they're the ones that go closer to his actual structure." Roman said, "I have people in Nashville, lawyers, and others." He said it without elaboration, and she decided not to ask for it. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "Tell me." "I need you to pull back on the partnership announcement." He went still. "Claire, not permanently. Temporarily. 2 days." She kept her voice even. "He's watching the alliance between us. Every move I make with your backing, he recalibrates around you. I need him to think I'm isolated. I need him to get comfortable enough to move again, because the next move he makes is going to show me something about the 11 documents I still don't fully understand." Roman looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to let him think he's winning. For 48 hours, yes. And if he moves against the properties in those 48 hours, then we deal with that." She met his eyes. "I need him to move on instinct instead of strategy. Scared people move on instinct, and right now he's starting to get scared." Another long look. Then 48 hours. "Thank you." He stood and then didn't quite leave. He was at the door when he turned and said, without any particular tone, the way he said most things, "For what it's worth. The way you're handling this." "Don't," she said. He nodded once and left. She was reviewing the property documents with Victoria at 11 a.m. when her assistant knocked. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Jenna said, with the careful voice of someone who knew she was about to make things worse. "Your mother is here." Clara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Then, send her in." Margaret Whitmore was 68 and had spent her entire adult life believing that problems between people were fundamentally problems of communication, that if everyone would simply talk things through calmly and openly, the uncomfortable edges of any situation could be smoothed to something livable. She'd raised Bianca on this principle. She'd raised Clara on this principle, and Clara had rewired it into something more practical, which her mother had never entirely forgiven her for. She walked in and stopped when she saw the documents on the table. Her face went through several things quickly. Then she sat down across from Clara and folded her hands and said, "Bianca called me this morning. I assumed she would. She's devastated." Clara looked at her mother. "She made a terrible mistake," Margaret said. "She knows that." Mom." Clara kept her voice flat. "I don't have the bandwidth for this today. She's your sister. She took $900,000 from my company. She took the man I was going to marry. She sent me a photograph on my wedding day specifically to maximize the damage." Clara paused. "I love Bianca. I have always loved Bianca, And I have spent our entire lives making space for her in ways that cost me things I didn't tell you about because I knew you'd tell me it was what family does. She leaned forward slightly. This is not a communication problem. This is a crime. Her mother's hands tightened against each other. You can't involve the police in family. There already is involvement, Victoria said quietly from the corner. This is a financial crime investigation. It has been since last night. Margaret looked at Victoria, then back at Clara. Something moved through her face that was more complicated than Clara had seen there before, not just distress, but a deeper, older thing. The particular pain of a parent who has, in trying to protect one child, failed another in ways she can't take back. I didn't know, her mother said finally, quietly. About the money, about the documents. I thought Bianca and Vincent. I thought it was just what? Clara said. I thought it was just feelings. That got out of hand. She stopped. I didn't know he was using her. He was using both of us, Clara said. The difference is Bianca knew about it, and I didn't. The room was quiet. Her mother looked very old suddenly. Clara noticed that the way grief could do that to a person in real time collapsed the years into the face at once. Mom, she said, and her voice came out softer than she'd intended. I can't protect Bianca from the consequences of what she did. Can't. And I can't spend my energy right now managing how Bianca feels about that. She exhaled. I need you to go home. I will call you when I can. Please don't bring her here. Margaret stood. She paused at the door. Without turning around, she said the hair comb. Her voice was unsteady. I know where she got it. I gave it to her. She told me she wanted to wear it as something borrowed at your wedding. To feel connected to you. A long pause. I thought it was sweet. The door closed. Clara sat very still for 45 seconds. Victoria didn't speak. The revelation settled like sediment, slow, heavy, reconfiguring the bottom of everything she thought she understood. Bianca hadn't taken the comb. Her mother had given it to her. Which meant Bianca had lied to their mother, had constructed an innocent explanation for something she'd already planned to wear in a very different context. Which meant the level of deliberateness in what Bianca had done was not something that had spiraled out of control. It had been architected. It had been thought through. Clara felt something in her chest that she recognized distantly as grief, the specific kind that came from realizing a person you loved was capable of something you couldn't have imagined them being capable of, not because you'd been blind, but because the thing they'd done had required a deliberateness that rewrote everything you thought you knew about who they were. She picked up her pen and went back to the documents. By 2 p.m., Victoria's signature analyst had confirmed what they already knew. The forged signatures showed evidence of practiced copy, multiple rehearsal marks, visible under spectral imaging, consistent with someone who had worked from an existing sample over an extended period. The analyst put the confidence level for forgery at 94%. By 3:30 p.m., Ethan had completed his full audit, 8 properties clean, 6 compromised. The 6 compromised ones represented 41% of Whitmore Estates' total asset value. At 4 p.m., Claire received an email from Gerald Fitch, her advisory board member, the one who'd called that morning with his careful suggestions about leadership transitions. The email was 2 sentences. I've been asked to convey that a private meeting between you and Vincent Devereaux, without attorneys present, might resolve the current situation to the benefit of all parties. This offer expires at 9 p.m. tonight. She read it twice. She understood what it was Vincent, using the board member as a messenger, offering her a back channel, framing it as a resolution offer. What it actually was, a test. He wanted to know if she was scared enough to take an off-the-record meeting without her lawyer. She called Gerald's number. He picked up and started to say something, and she said, "Tell him no," and hung up. 5:17 p.m., Dennis Park called. "The 2 men on your building since this morning," he said. "They're gone. Gone where? We followed them. They're at Whitmore Charleston." He paused. "The actual property. They went inside. They told the property manager they were conducting a corporate inspection and they had documentation." Everything in Clara's body went cold. What documentation? A management authorization from Meridian Advisory Partners. Your property manager let them in because the documentation looked legitimate and referenced an ownership interest she wasn't aware of. Another pause. Clara, they've been in there for 2 hours. The management trigger. Document 13. Vincent had deployed it. Not as a future contingency now. Today, while she'd been sitting in her office reading documents and thinking she had 48 hours to operate in relative quiet. Get me on the phone with Charleston, she said. Right now. The property manager, she's trying to reach you already. She's been trying for 20 minutes. Your assistant. Put her through. The call connected, and her Charleston property manager, a sharp, reliable woman named Keisha Drummond, who had run the property for 4 years without ever calling Clara in a panic, was speaking in the tightly controlled voice of someone who was in fact panicking. Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry. I didn't know they had paperwork. It had your company letterhead. It had... Keisha, listen to me. Are they still in the building? They're in the accounting office. They asked for access to the financial records. I gave them access to the front-end records, but the server room is locked, and I kept telling them I needed to reach you first. Lock the server room and don't unlock it, regardless of what they show you. Call your local police non-emergency line and tell them you have unauthorized individuals accessing private business records. Do it now, while you're still on the phone with me. But they have documentation that says, I know what the documentation says. It's forged. Lock the room and call the police. Clara was already standing, already reaching for her jacket. I'll be on a plane in 2 hours. She hung up and looked at Victoria, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand. The management trigger, Victoria said. He moved while I was watching him watching me. Clara pulled her jacket on. He didn't wait for 48 hours. He didn't wait for the forgery case. He sent people to Charleston today because he knew I'd be focused here. He's splitting your attention. He's splitting my resources, she thought, fast and hard. Victoria, stay here. Keep working the legal filings. I need everything we have on the management agreement challenge filed tonight, regardless of whether I'm here. Ethan, I need you. She turned. Ethan was in the doorway. Come with me, she called Roman from the elevator. He deployed the management trigger in Charleston, she said, without preamble. He moved today. Roman said, I know. I just got a call from my Nashville contact. Same play. Men showed up at your Nashville property an hour ago with Meridian documentation. Charleston and Nashville simultaneously. 2 properties, 2 teams, the same hour. While she'd been in her office thinking she was managing the pace of this. He was never scared, she said, and she heard her own voice come out flat and strange. I thought I was making him scared. He was never scared. He was waiting for me to think I had time. Roman said, Where are you going? Charleston. Don't. She stopped walking. What? If you go to Charleston, you're exactly where he wants you out of New York. Split from your legal team, reacting to his move instead of making your own. His voice was steady and direct, not arguing, just laying out facts. He wants you on a plane. He deployed Charleston and Nashville at the same time for one reason, to get you moving in a direction that takes you away from the filing. She stood in the lobby of her building, jacket on, phone pressed to her ear, and she thought about that. If I don't go, she said, he secures the financial records. Keisha locked the server room. The police are coming. He can't get what he needs tonight. A beat. But if you leave New York tonight, who is here to watch what he does next in your own building? She looked at the lobby, at the glass doors, at the street beyond them, ordinary and indifferent. She thought about the men who'd been watching her building that morning and had left at 5 p.m. She thought about the fact that they'd left at 5 p.m., which was exactly when the Charleston team went into the accounting office. She thought about timing, about the specific choreography of a plan that had been built over 18 months, impulsively, by a man who did not make decisions impulsively. He'd moved 2 pieces at once. The question was whether the Charleston and Nashville moves were the real play or whether they were the distraction. She said, Roman. What's the zoning board member's name? The councilman in the letter. Pause. Peter Kavanaugh. Where is he right now? She heard him pull something up. Another pause longer this time. Then he's at a dinner. at the Devereaux Holdings corporate suite at the Meridian Hotel. His voice shifted. Clara, he's not waiting on the zoning board meeting, she said. He's not waiting 4 months. He's moving the permits tonight. She pressed her back against the wall. If those permits get pulled or conditioned, the Midtown and Brooklyn properties lose their operational status. He doesn't need to own them. He just needs to make them unworkable. And you can't run a company with 3 critical properties neutralized. And he walks into my board meeting next week and tells my investors that Whitmore Estates is in regulatory crisis, and he has a resolution if I'll just sit down and talk. Her voice came out thin. That's the real play. Charleston and Nashville were the noise. This is the move. She didn't go to Charleston. She turned around and went back upstairs. Dennis Park was already at his desk when she walked in. She said, Peter Kavanaugh, Meridian Hotel tonight. I need to know who else is in that room on it. Victoria looked up from her computer. What happened? He's moving on the permits tonight. It's not Charleston. Victoria went still. If he conditions the permits. I know, Clara, the Midtown and Brooklyn properties generate 40% of our annual revenue. I know, if those go into regulatory hold, Victoria. She sat down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She looked at the documents. Still said there are 14 of them, each one a piece of a structure that had been built beneath her feet while she was standing on it. I know exactly what happens if those permits get conditioned. I know what my investor meeting looks like next week, if that happens. I know what the public narrative looks like. She exhaled. So tell me what I have. Right now. Tonight. What do I have that I can use before 11 p.m.? Victoria was quiet for exactly 5 seconds, the length of time she needed to run through her actual inventory, rather than her worry. Then she said the Kavanaugh letter. If that letter became public official taking direction from organized crime to influence permit decisions. It's not organized crime on the letter. It's Meridian. But the chain from Meridian to Devereaux, we have that chain. We have it in private documents that are currently part of an investigation. Victoria met her eyes. If we release that letter publicly before the investigation is formalized, we could compromise the case. And if we don't release it, we lose the permits, and possibly the company. Silence. Clara thought about the version of herself that had stood at an altar 2 days ago, holding flowers, believing the person she'd chosen had chosen her back. She thought about how much of her life she'd spent being careful with her business, careful with her relationships, careful about not becoming the kind of person who caused scenes, or made demands, or drew the kind of attention that made people uncomfortable. She thought about what careful had gotten her. There's another way, she said slowly. Victoria waited. I don't release the letter, Clara said. I give it to the right person to release. She looked up. Who covers City Hall, who has been working on Devereaux-adjacent stories for more than a year and has the editorial backing to run something fast? Victoria blinked. Then her eyes narrowed, not in objection, but in the focused, rapid calculation of someone seeing a path open. Nora Chen at the Tribune, she said. She broke the East Side zoning story 2 years ago. Does she know this territory? She's been circling Vincent Devereaux's operation for 18 months. She's told me she has pieces, but nothing that ties together. Tonight it ties together, Clara said. Call her. Don't tell her what we have, yet just get her on the phone and find out where she is and whether she can meet me in the next 2 hours. Victoria was already dialing. Clara sat back and felt the full weight of what she was about to do settle on her. Releasing information to a journalist wasn't the same as filing a legal document. It was a different kind of move, messier, less controlled, with consequences she couldn't fully predict or contain. It would accelerate everything. It would make Vincent angrier and faster, and it would remove any remaining possibility of a quiet resolution. But the quiet resolution had never been real. She understood that now. She'd spent 2 days thinking. She was managing the pace of this fight, and Vincent had spent those 2 days executing a plan he'd built over 18 months, moving on 3 fronts simultaneously while she was watching one. She couldn't outpatience him. She'd already lost that race without knowing she was running it. What she could do was change the rules of the race entirely. Her phone buzzed, A text from an unknown number, which she opened because she'd been opening unknown contacts for 2 days, and each one had contained something she needed to know. This one was 3 words. Don't trust Roman. She stared at it. Read it again. 3 words. No context. No follow-up. The number already returning as disconnected when she tried to call it back. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She thought about Roman telling her not to go to Charleston. She thought about Roman knowing about Peter Kavanaugh before she'd asked him. Sips splitting. She thought about Roman arriving at her wedding uninvited and sitting on the steps with his jacket folded across his knee with the particular calm of someone who was not surprised by what they found. She thought about the original question she'd asked Victoria 48 hours ago on those same steps. What did she know? And when? She applied it now, coldly, to a different person. What did Roman Callahan know, and when? And if the answer to when was before the wedding, before he claimed to have found the documents, then the question underneath that question was the one that made the air leave her chest completely. Whose side was Roman Callahan actually on? Clara sat with the 3-word text for 90 seconds. Not because she needed 90 seconds to read 3 words, but because she needed that time to do what she did with every piece of information that arrived in a form designed to destabilize. She put it to the side without discarding it. The way you set down something hot without dropping it. Don't trust Roman. Untraceable. Time to arrive at precisely the moment she was most isolated and most dependent on Roman's resources. Which meant one of 2 things. It was true, and someone with knowledge of the situation was trying to warn her at considerable personal risk. Or it was manufactured. Seeded Vincent's network to fracture the one alliance she had, standing between her company and complete collapse. She couldn't know which. Not yet. So she held it like she held the stone-cold step 2 days ago, aware of it, grounded by it, not yet moved by it. She called Roman. He picked up on the first ring again, same as before. I was about to call you, he said. Kavanaugh left the dinner. Already? 20 minutes ago. Alone. My contact says the meeting ended early. Something shifted inside the room. Did your contact hear anything? Raised voices. Vincent's name. And then Kavanaugh walked out. A pause. Something spooked him. Either he got cold feet about whatever they were asking him to do, or someone warned him that the room was being watched. Clara thought about that. Roman, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight. Go ahead. How long did you have the Devereaux documents before you came to my wedding? The pause that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. She counted them. I told you, he said. 11 days. That's when your compliance team flagged it. I'm asking how long you personally knew. Another pause. Longer. Clara, straight answer. She heard him exhale, the sound of a man deciding something, the specific quality of breath that preceded a truth that had been held back. 17 days, he said. My compliance team flagged it at 11. I'd had a private indication 6 days before that. Her jaw tightened. What kind of indication? A source. Someone inside Vincent's network who reached out to me directly. Off the record, nothing documented. They told me Vincent was using a woman, a business owner, as a vehicle for a corporate takeover through marriage. They didn't give me your name initially. I had to work backward through the business description to understand it was you. He paused. By the time I confirmed it was Whitmore Estates, my compliance team had already found the paper trail independently. 17 days, she said. You had 17 days, and you came to my wedding. I know how that sounds. Tell me why. Because my source told me Vincent knew I'd found out. Told me he was watching for any contact between us. If I'd called you directly, if I'd reached out to you or your attorney before I had the full documented picture, and Vincent knew I'd done that, he would have destroyed the paper trail. He had people inside the county filing systems. He could have pulled those property records in 24 hours if he'd been tipped that I was moving. His voice was flat, not defensive. Explaining, not justifying. I needed the documents secured before I made contact. That's why I waited. Your source, Clara said. Who are they? I can't tell you that. Can or won't. Both. She sat with the phone against her ear, and the hum of her office building around her, and the text on her other screen, don't trust, Roman. She thought about 17 days versus 11. She thought about a source inside Vincent's network who'd reached out to Roman specifically. She thought about the specific detail that the source had told Vincent Roman had found out, which meant the source was communicating with both sides. Your source is feeding information to Vincent too, she said. Silence, Roman. It's possible, he said. I don't know the full picture of their situation. So the person who told you about me might also be the person who sent me this text. She looked at the 3 words on her screen. And you don't know which direction they're actually loyal to. No, he said. I don't. She made a decision. The kind of decision you made when you had no good options and several bad ones. And the only metric available was which bad option gave you the most control going forward. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it as information, not as an accusation. All right, I received an anonymous text 10 minutes ago telling me not to trust you. The silence on his end was different from the others. Not calculating. Something closer to the silence of a man who had been braced for a blow and felt it land. Okay, he said. The fact that I'm telling you means I haven't decided to act on it, she said. But it also means my margin for trust is exactly as thin as the situation requires it to be. Nothing more. She paused. Can you work with that? Yes, he said, without hesitation. Yes, I can work with that. Then here's where we are. She pulled the document stack toward her. Kavanaugh walked out of the dinner. That means the permit move didn't happen tonight, which buys us time, maybe hours, maybe until morning. I'm meeting with Nora Chen at the Tribune in 40 minutes. I'm giving her the Kavanaugh letter and the chain from Meridian to Devereaux Holdings. She heard him start to object and talked over it. I know the risks to the investigation. I've weighed them. If I don't break the permit play, I lose 40% of my revenue base, and I walk into my board meeting next week with a collapsing company, and Vincent wins without ever going to court. The story goes live when? Nora says she can have it online by 6 a.m. Print by morning edition. That's 8 hours. 8 hours. Vincent will know by 6:01 a.m. that the stories is out. And then he moves. Fast and hard, and without the restraint he's been showing. I know, Clara said, so whatever I haven't secured by 6 a.m., I need to accept losing. A long pause. What do you need from me tonight? The Nashville property. Your people there. I need them in position to document whatever Meridian's representatives try to do at that location over the next 8 hours. Video, audio if legal in Tennessee, written record of every person who enters and every document shown. Done. And I need you to find out who your source is working for. Tonight. He was quiet for a moment. That might not be a safe conversation for them. I know, she said, but I need to know which direction to face. She hung up and looked at Victoria. Call Nora Chen. Tell her I'm coming. The Tribune offices were 12 blocks away, and Clara walked it. Not because she needed the air, though she did. The cold hitting her face and her lungs like something physical she could push against, but because she needed 12 blocks of moving through the world without anyone watching what she did next. She walked fast, her jacket pulled close, and she thought about the shape of the next 8 hours. And what they required of her. She had spent 2 days being reactive, understanding what Vincent had done, documenting it, building legal cases around it. That work was necessary, and she didn't regret it. But it had also kept her in a position where she was always one step behind a plan that had been running for 18 months. She was annotating someone else's strategy rather than running her own. Tonight that changed. Nora Chen was 38, compact, with the particular energy of a journalist who had been working a story for a long time and could smell that the story was about to break open. She met Clara in a conference room on the 4th floor, and she had a recorder on the table before Clara sat down, which Clara looked at and said, "Not yet." Nora clicked it off without argument. "Tell me what you have." Clara told her. Not everything. She wasn't operational enough about which details damaged her legal case, and which ones didn't, to hand over everything, blind but the structural shape of it, the Kavanaugh letter, the Meridian chain, the property filings, the forged documents, the zoning play that had nearly happened tonight. She laid it out in the flat, precise way she laid out business proposals. Without editorial, just architecture. Nora listened without writing anything down. When Clara finished, she said, "The letter. I need to see the original." Clara put it on the table. Nora read it. "Read it again. Put it down. How did you get this?" "A notary who cooperated with my investigation. I'll need her on record." "No. She's protected. You can verify the letter through Kavanaugh's office if you move fast enough before he gets ahead of it." Clara met Nora's eyes. "I'm giving you a documented chain from a known Devereaux shell company to a city council member's written agreement to influence permit decisions. You have enough to run it. I have enough to run a version of it." Nora drummed her fingers once on the table. "I've been working Devereaux-adjacent stories for 18 months. I have corroborating context for everything you're showing me. But my editor is going to want confirmation on at least 2 independent points before 6 a.m. "What 2 points?" "Kavanaugh. I want him on the phone tonight, not for comment, just to establish he knows the letter exists. His reaction tells me everything I need." She paused. "And I want the Meridian to Devereaux corporate chain independently verified through public records. The chain is documented in New York and Delaware Secretary of State filings," Clara said. "It's public record. Your researcher can pull it in 20 minutes. Nora nodded, already moving. "Give me 4 hours. Clara stood. "You have until 5:30 a.m. If it's not online by then, I need to know so I can adjust." "It'll be online by 5. Clara walked back out into the cold. She got back to her office at 11:45 p.m. Dennis Park was at his desk with the expression of a man who had been holding information and needed to put it down. "Kavanaugh," he said. "What about him?" After he left the dinner, he drove to his office. "He's been there for 2 hours. Dennis pulled up a photo on his screen, taken from street level, the lit windows of a city hall office building. "He's not alone. There's a woman in there. My contact in the building says she's been with him for 90 minutes. "Who is she?" Dennis turned the screen to face her. The photo was grainy, taken through a window at distance, but the face was identifiable. Clara looked at it for a long moment. Bianca, not Vincent. Not a lawyer. Not anyone Clara would have predicted. Bianca Whitmore was sitting in Peter Kavanaugh's office at midnight, and whatever they were discussing had kept Kavanaugh inside City Hall for 2 hours after walking out of a dinner with Vincent Devereaux. Clara sat down slowly. She thought about Bianca's phone call. It didn't start the way it looks. She thought about the $900,000 funneled to Whitmore Creative Ventures. She thought about a woman who had spent 29 years living in the shadow of her older sister and had finally found a man willing to promise her a spotlight. And what happened when that man began to show her the full shape of what he was actually building. She picked up her phone and called Bianca. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She hung up, called again. Voicemail. She sat for a moment and then she texted, "I know where you are. I know who you're with. If you have something to tell me, call me in the next 30 minutes. The response came in 40 seconds. Not a call, a text. "Meet me." Not the office. My apartment now. Clara looked at Dennis. "I need you with me." Bianca's apartment was in Tribeca, a place Clara had helped her find 3 years ago when Bianca had moved back to the city from LA. Had helped her furnish in the slow, patient way of an older sister who did things right the first time to avoid having to do them again. Clara had chosen the couch. She'd assembled the bookshelf. She'd paid 2 months of the security deposit when Bianca's finances had been thin, and their mother had said, "Clara, could you just?" And Clara had said yes, because she always said yes. She walked into that apartment now, and Bianca was standing in the kitchen with her arms wrapped around herself, and her face showing something Clara had never seen on it before. Not the performed distress of someone who wanted sympathy. Something rawer. The genuine look of a person who had been scared for a long time and was running out of the energy required to keep hiding it. "He's going to cut me off," Bianca said. Not as an opening, not as a greeting. Just straight into it, the way people spoke when they'd been rehearsing and had finally decided to stop. "He told me 2 days ago, the day after the wedding fell apart, that if I didn't stay quiet and stay out of whatever was coming, he'd expose everything. The money, my involvement, all of it. He said he'd make it look like I was the one who orchestrated the financial fraud and he was a victim. Clara stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her sister's face. "What did you do when he told you that?" "I didn't do anything." Bianca's voice cracked. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I stayed quiet, but then tonight, someone from his organization came to my door. Not Vincent, someone else. A man I'd never seen. He gave me a folder." She pointed at the table. "He said it was Vincent's insurance. Said if I talked to anyone, if I helped you in any way, this goes to the press." Clara looked at the folder on the table. She crossed the kitchen and opened it. Inside were documents, financial records, wire transfer authorizations, company formation papers, all of them, with Bianca's signature prominently featured. Everything structured to make Bianca look like the architect. The person who'd initiated the shell companies, who'd authorized the transfers, who'd set up the fake consulting agreements. Vincent's name appeared only at the edges, as a secondary signatory, as an advisor, as someone brought in after the fact. It was a complete inversion of the truth, and it was meticulous. Clara could see immediately how it would read to an investigator who didn't already know the actual sequence of events. A younger woman with financial access to her sister's company, who'd set up a brand funded by company money, who'd signed off on a series of transfers and agreements. Vincent Devereaux, in this version, was almost incidental. "He built your frame before he built his exit," Clara said. Bianca was nodding, rapid and small, the nod of someone who couldn't quite make themselves stop moving. I didn't know he was doing this. I thought the business structure was legitimate. He told me the money was an investment from outside the company," he said. "Bianca." Clara's voice came out flat, not angry, flat in the way of someone who had moved past the point where anger was the primary response. "You knew the money wasn't clean. You didn't know the specifics, but you knew." Her sister stopped nodding. The honesty of the silence was its own kind of answer. "Why Kavanaugh?" Clara said. Bianca blinked. "What?" "You went to Kavanaugh's office tonight. Peter Kavanaugh, the city council member, who met with Vincent's people about my permits." Clara held the folder. "Why him? How do you know him?" Something moved across Bianca's face. "He came to me 3 weeks ago. He said he was concerned about Vincent's involvement in city contracts, and he wanted to understand the full picture of what Vincent was doing. He said he was trying to get out of whatever he'd been pulled into. You've been talking to him for 3 weeks. He reached out to me because he knew I was close to Vincent." Clara stood very still. "Bianca, who else has he talked to? In the past 3 weeks, who else has Kavanaugh been meeting with besides you?" "I don't—" Bianca stopped. "He mentioned someone. He said there was a businessman who'd been helping him understand the structure. Someone Vincent had history with." Clara's chest went cold. "Did he say a name?" Bianca thought. "Callahan," she said. He mentioned Callahan. Roman had been talking to Kavanaugh for 3 weeks. At the same time, he'd been positioning himself as Clara's ally. At the same time, his source had been feeding him information about Vincent and possibly feeding information back. The anonymous text hit her again, with different weight. "Don't trust Roman." She looked at her sister, and she thought about 17 days versus 11, and the source Roman couldn't identify, and the calls he'd been expecting before she made them, and the way he'd known about Kavanaugh before she'd asked him. She thought about a man who showed up uninvited to her wedding with information that was already 3 days late to be useful, and how that timing made sense, only if the goal wasn't to stop the wedding, but to position himself in the aftermath. She thought about the one question she hadn't asked yet because she'd been too busy reacting to ask the right things. What did Roman Callahan actually want from Whitmore Estates? She picked up her phone and called Victoria. "I need everything you can find on Callahan International's acquisition history," she said. "Tonight. Specifically any companies they've acquired that were in financial distress at the time of acquisition." She paused. "And I need to know if they've ever made a move on a hospitality brand." Victoria said, "Give me 2 hours." She looked at Bianca. "Do you still have the folder they brought you?" "That's it," Bianca said, pointing at what Clara was holding. "Do they have copies?" he said. The man who brought it said this was the only copy. That it was a gesture of good faith. Bianca's voice was unsteady. "He said Vincent wanted me to know what he could do, not to actually do it yet." Clara looked at the folder in her hands. A gesture of good faith from Vincent Devereaux. She thought about what kind of man sent his leverage as a physical document to the person being leveraged, and understood that the document wasn't actually the leverage. The leverage was the knowledge that other copies existed, somewhere she couldn't find them. "You went to Kavanaugh tonight because you were scared," Clara said. "Yes." And Callahan had already been prepping him. "I think so." She set the folder down. "I need you to do something, and I need you to understand that whether or not you do it has consequences either way." Bianca looked at her. Her face was stripped down to something Clara hadn't seen since they were children, the face of someone who had run out of performance and was just standing there undefended. It should have made Clara feel something softer. She noticed that it mostly made her feel tired. "Whatever you need," Bianca said. "I need a sworn statement. Everything Vincent told you, every meeting, every instruction, every document he asked you to sign, every promise he made about what the company would become. Dated and detailed." She held her sister's eyes. "And I need it before 5 a.m., because the story that's going to run in the Tribune at 5 is going to move fast, and your statement needs to be in Victoria's hands before it does." "If I give a statement, you become a witness instead of a target," Clara said. "It's the only version of this where you come out with anything intact." Bianca was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing Clara had not expected her to say. "I'm sorry, Clara." And her voice had the specific sound of someone who was not performing grief, but experiencing it, which made it harder to hear than the performance would have been. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am." Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. She thought about the pearl hair comb. She thought about their mother, saying, "I thought it was sweet." She thought about 29 years of loving someone who loved you back imperfectly, which was, she understood, the only way anyone ever loved anyone. "Call Victoria," she said. "Start talking." She left Bianca's apartment at 1:30 a.m. Dennis was outside, parked at the curb, and he looked at her face when she got in and said nothing, which was the correct response. She sat in the passenger seat and looked at the street. "Callahan," she said. "What about him? I need to know where he is right now." Dennis pulled out his phone, made a call, a brief, low conversation she half listened to. "Then he's at the Callahan International offices. Been there since 10 p.m. What does Callahan International's acquisition history look like in the hospitality space?" Dennis glanced at her. "You think he's coming for your company too?" "I think the possibility requires serious attention." She looked at her hands. Two men competing to acquire the same asset will sometimes form temporary alliances. They'll cooperate just long enough to destabilize us the asset, and then separate when the competition actually begins. You think Roman came to your wedding to help himself, not you. I think Roman came to my wedding because a destabilized Whitmore estate stripped of Vincent's fraudulent claims and in a public crisis, with investor confidence shaken, is exactly the kind of acquisition target his company prefers. She said it without emotion, just the flat architecture of the possibility. And I think the 48 hours he's been spending as my ally have given him an extraordinary amount of detailed information about the internal state of my company, my legal vulnerabilities, my property portfolio, and my investor relationships. Dennis said, "That's a lot of thinking. It's a lot of information," she said. "And I might be wrong, but I can't afford to find out I'm wrong after the fact." Her phone buzzed. "Victoria," she answered. "I pulled Callahan International's M&A history," Victoria said. The sound of pages in the background, the particular friction of someone moving fast through printed documents. They've done 11 acquisitions in the past dozen years. 8 of them were companies in active distress, financial crisis, legal investigation, or public reputation damage. She paused. 3 were hospitality adjacent. A boutique hotel group in 2019. A resort management company in 2021. A luxury property developer in 2022. What happened to those companies after acquisition? All 3 were folded into Callahan International's real estate division. Rebranded. The leadership was replaced within 12 months in each case. A pause. "Clara, the boutique hotel group. It was in the middle of a fraud investigation when Callahan acquired it. The investigation created the distress that made the acquisition price favorable. Clara looked out the car window at the dark street. He waits for the investigation, she said. He lets the crisis mature until the valuation drops. Then he moves. That's the pattern. How long does it typically take? From the moment he identifies a target to acquisition. The fastest was 4 months. The longest was 8. 4 to 8 months. Roman Callahan had known about Whitmore Estates for 17 days. He was, if the pattern held, extraordinarily early in his timeline. Which meant he was either moving faster than usual, or he'd been watching her company before the Devereaux situation surfaced, and the Devereaux documents had simply accelerated his timetable. She thought about the partnership agreement he'd proposed. The formal evaluation that his team had been conducting for 3 months, the due diligence that had, he claimed, uncovered Vincent's documents. 3 months of his people inside her company's financial information. 3 months of the kind of access that would tell you exactly what an acquisition would cost and what it would yield. Victoria, she said, how formally structured is our current legal relationship with Callahan International? Do we have anything in writing? The partnership evaluation agreement. Both parties signed an NDA and an exclusivity window for evaluation purposes. A pause. The exclusivity window prevents us from entering into a competing partnership arrangement with another entity for 60 days. Who proposed that language? A longer pause. Callahan's attorneys drafted the agreement. She sat with that. The exclusivity window meant she couldn't formalize a protective partnership with anyone else for 60 days. Roman had written that into the first document they'd signed together, before she'd known Vincent's full operation, before she'd understood she needed protection. He'd locked out her other options while presenting himself as her best option. That was not the behavior of an ally. That was the behavior of a man who was managing a process. Can we break the exclusivity, she said. For cause, yes. We can demonstrate that Callahan International failed to disclose a material conflict of interest during the negotiation period. He disclosed that he had documents about Vincent. He didn't disclose that he'd been aware of my company as an acquisition target. That's a material non-disclosure, Victoria said. Her voice had shifted into the particular register of someone who was angry on behalf of a client and channeling it into precision. It would void the exclusivity clause. Then we void it, Clara said. Tonight, draft the notice. Clara, if we void it and Roman retaliates. He's going to move anyway, she said. He's been moving. I've just been looking the wrong direction. She pressed the heel of her hand against her temple. Get the notice drafted. I want to serve it before 5 a.m., before the Tribune story runs, before he has time to respond to the story and reposition. She hung up and sat in the car, and for 30 seconds, she let herself feel the full weight of what the past 72 hours had actually been. 2 men, not one. One who'd tried to take her company through marriage and forgery, and one who'd been moving on it through financial crisis and manufactured trust. She was asset in the middle, and she was also the only person in the situation who hadn't been running a strategy from the beginning. She'd been running on reaction, on instinct, on the accumulated intelligence of a woman who was good at reading people and had still failed to read 2 of them correctly. She thought about what she had left. The Tribune story was going out at 5 a.m. regardless. The forgery case was filed. Bianca was giving a statement. Patricia Sloan was protected. Ethan had the financials secured. The 6 compromised properties were a wound, but not a fatal one, if she moved fast enough on the legal challenges. What she didn't have was the board. Her investor board, which met in 6 days, and which, if she walked in there with 6 properties in legal dispute, and a failed partnership agreement, and 2 simultaneous investigations and a story in the Tribune that morning, would face enormous pressure to force a leadership review. Gerald Fitch would push for it. She already knew that. Gerald had been working the edges of this since yesterday morning, and he had the ear of 3 other board members, and he was exactly the kind of man who believed that a crisis was a woman's fault and a competent man's opportunity. She needed the board before the story ran. She needed at least 4 of the 7 members solidly in her corner before dawn. "Take me back to the office," she said. It was 2:10 a.m. when she arrived. She sat down at her desk and she started making calls. Board members who she knew personally, who had been with her company since the early days, who had watched her build something from a single renovation project into 14 properties across 6 states. She called them at 2 a.m. because she had no other time, and she was honest with each of them in the way she'd been trained by her mother not to be directly, without softening, without managing their comfort. She told them what Vincent had done. She told them what the investigation had found. She told them the Tribune story would run at 5, and she wanted them to hear it from her first. She did not tell them about Roman. Not yet. That was a complication for after. By 3:45 a.m., she had 4 of the 7 board members. 4 who told her they were with her, who told her to call them at dawn, who told her Gerald Fitch could go to hell in their specific and varied vocabularies. It wasn't a majority for all decisions, but it was enough to block a forced leadership review. At 4:05 a.m., Victoria called. "The notice is drafted. Send it. Roman gets a copy the moment I send it." "I know, he's going to call you." "I know, Clara." Victoria's voice dropped. "Are you sure about this? If we're wrong about him." "We're not wrong," Clara said. "We might be wrong about his motives. Maybe he's not planning an acquisition. Maybe it's something else. But we're not wrong that he wasn't straight with us about what he knew and when. And I can't build anything on a foundation that has crack in it." She exhaled. "Send it." The notification went at 4:08 a.m. Roman called at 4:11 a.m. She answered. "You voided the exclusivity," he said. "I did." "On what grounds? Material non-disclosure." "You failed to tell me you'd been evaluating Whitmore Estates as an acquisition target before you came to me as an ally." She kept her voice level. "Your due diligence team didn't find Vincent's documents because they were conducting a partnership evaluation. They found them because they were conducting an acquisition assessment. Those are different processes with different information gathering priorities." Silence. "You knew what my company was worth," she said. "You knew what it would be worth in distress. You knew that helping me through a crisis that you'd accelerated, disclosing information to me strategically would put you in the best possible position when the dust settled." "That's a significant interpretation," he said. "Is it wrong?" A long pause, the longest he'd given her, and in that pause, in the specific quality of its length, she had her answer. Not because he was about to lie, she was past the point of worrying about that, but because a man who had nothing to hide would have answered faster. "It's not entirely wrong," he said. She sat with the honesty of that. She hadn't expected it. She'd expected deflection, and the absence of it created a complicated, unwelcome respect. "When you came to my wedding," she said, "were you ever actually trying to help me?" "Yes," and this came fast, without the pause. "Both things can be true, Clara. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. That doesn't mean I was indifferent to what was happening to you. It means I was useful to you. It means I thought we could both benefit from the same outcome." He paused. "I still think that. The difference," she said, "is that I now know what you want. Before, I didn't, and I don't work with people whose full interest I can't see." She looked at her desk, at the window, at the faint lightening of the sky outside that meant it was close to 5. "The story runs in 45 minutes. After it does, I'm going to be in the middle of the hardest fight of my professional life, and I'm going to be fighting it alone." "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but right now alone is the only position I trust." She paused. "Don't make moves against my company, Roman. I'm warning you once." A beat. Noted. She hung up. At 4:58 a.m., Nora Chen sent a single text, "Going live in 2 minutes. You might want to be sitting down." Clara was already sitting down. She was sitting in her office with her cold coffee and her stacked documents and the first gray light of morning coming through the windows. A sound like green wood splitting, and she was thinking about everything she'd built and how much of it was still standing and what it was going to take to keep it standing through what was coming. Her phone lit up at 5:01 a.m. Then again. Then 3 times in quick succession. The story was live. At 5:04 a.m., her phone rang. The number was one she'd been given 18 months ago and had never expected to use the direct line of the New York District Attorney's office, the investigative division. The man on the other end introduced himself as Senior Investigator Paul Denton, and he said, "Miss Whitmore, we've been building a case against the Devereaux organization for 14 months. We'd like to talk about what you found." She thought about 14 months. She thought about Vincent building his operation over 18 months and the DA building a case over 14 and herself walking into the middle of it 62 hours ago in a silk dress, holding wilting peonies, completely unaware that she'd been standing in the center of something much larger than a wedding. "I have documents," she said. "I have financial forensics, sworn statements, and original evidence of forgery across 6 properties in 4 states. Can you come in this morning?" "Tell me when," she said. At 9 a.m., she received a text from a number she now recognized as Vincent's private line, not the one he'd used for their relationship, a different one she'd found in the documents. Text was 4 words. "You made a mistake." She read it, turned her phone face down on the desk, looked at the morning coming through the window. Then she picked her phone back up and typed back, "Which one? I need to be specific." She sent it, stood up, put on her jacket. She had a meeting with the district attorney's office in 90 minutes and a board call in 4 hours and 6 properties with compromised paperwork and a sister giving a statement and a journalist whose story was already being picked up by 3 national outlets according to the alerts coming through on her laptop. A sound like green wood splitting, and somewhere in the city Vincent Devereaux was reading the Tribune and understanding for the first time that the woman he'd built an 18-month strategy around had just changed the rules of the game entirely. She was out of the office and in the elevator when her phone rang again. Unknown number. She almost let it go, she answered. The voice on the other end was male, low, with the particular cadence of someone speaking carefully in a place where they didn't want to be overheard. "Ms. Whitmore, you don't know me. My name is James Farrell. I've been inside the Devereaux organization for 4 years." A pause. "I'm the one who sent you the text about Roman Callahan." She pressed the elevator button for the lobby and kept the phone against her ear. "Why?" she said. "Because I've also been the one feeding information to Roman Callahan for 17 days, he said. "And before that, I fed information to the DA's office for 14 months. Another pause. "And I need you to know that Roman Callahan is not your enemy. But he's not your ally either. He's the third party in a situation that's been moving toward this moment for a long time." His voice dropped further. "And the thing nobody has told you yet, the thing even the DA doesn't know, is that Vincent Devereaux doesn't just have 6 of your properties." She stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. The morning doorman looked up and nodded. "What does he have?" she said. James Farrell said, "He has a buyer lined up. For all of Whitmore Estates. Someone who was going to purchase the company from him after the marriage gave him control." A pause. "The sale was scheduled for 60 days after your wedding date." She stood in the lobby of her building at 5:14 a.m. with the morning light just beginning to come through the glass doors, and she understood that the 18 months of strategy she'd been unraveling was not the whole plan. It was only the mechanism. The actual goal, the reason Vincent had built all of it, was a sale, a buyer, a transaction that would have transferred everything she had built in a decade to a third party she'd never met, for a price she would never see. 50 days after a wedding she'd almost walked into. "Who's the buyer?" she said. James Farrell said the name. And Clara Whitmore stood very still in the lobby of her building because the name James Farrell said was one she knew. The name James Farrell said was Gerald Fitch. Clara stood in the lobby of her building and felt the specific physical sensation of a puzzle, completing itself, not the satisfying click of something falling into place, the nauseating lurch of understanding that the picture you'd been assembling was the wrong picture entirely, that you'd been working from a frame someone else had built. And the actual image was something you hadn't been looking for because you hadn't known to look. Gerald Fitch, her advisory board member, her mentor, the man who'd spent 4 years attending her quarterly meetings, asking careful questions, offering calibrated guidance, calling himself invested in her success. The man who'd called yesterday morning with his careful suggestions about leadership transitions. The man who had 3 other board members in his orbit and who had been positioned, she now understood, not as an advisor, but as a shepherd, someone placed inside her company's governance structure to manage the conditions of an eventual acquisition. "How long?" she said into the phone. "Fitch approached Vincent 3 years ago," James Farrell said. "Not the other way around." Fitch identified Whitmore Estates as an undervalued asset with significant expansion potential. He brought Vincent in as the acquisition mechanism. The marriage was Fitch's idea. The marriage was Gerald Fitch's idea. Vincent had the capability to execute it. Fitch had the exit buyer, a private equity group he controls through a series of intermediaries. The plan was for Vincent to take legal control through the marriage, sell to Fitch's group at a prearranged price and split the premium. A pause. Fitch would have walked away with controlling interest in your company for approximately 40 cents on the dollar of its actual value. The remaining 60 cents would have gone to Vincent as the acquisition fee. She thought about 4 years. Gerald Fitch sitting at her board table for 4 years, eating her food at her quarterly dinners, signing cards for her company milestones, attending the opening of the Whitmore Charleston, and toasting her with champagne that she'd paid for. 4 years of manufactured closeness, manufactured investment, manufactured mentorship, all of it a patience game, all of it waiting for the mechanism to complete. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. James Farrell was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been feeding information to 3 different parties for 4 years and I am extremely tired," he said. "And because the DA's case goes sideways without Fitch, and the DA doesn't know about Fitch yet. Sound like green wood splitting, and because I need someone to know the full picture before I walk into the federal building this morning and give my statement. You're going in. At 7 a.m., he paused. "I'm not calling you for thanks. I'm calling you because you need to walk into your DA meeting with Fitch's name, and I don't have time to explain the full chain to you and also explain it to them." She processed that. A man who'd been living inside Vincent Devereaux's organization for 4 years, feeding information to the DA, to Roman Callahan, watching a plan unfold from the inside with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been playing multiple roles for so long he'd forgotten which one was real. She understood that exhaustion in a limited, 48-hour version. She didn't envy him the 4-year version. "One question," she said. "Make it fast. Is he clean?" A short pause. "He's not a saint, but he's not Fitch." Another pause. He genuinely didn't know about the acquisition plan. He found the Vincent layer and thought it was the whole thing. He had his own interests, he always does, but the Fitch layer would have cost him as much as it cost you. The line was quiet for a second. "He's going to want to talk to you." "I'd let him." The line went dead. Clara stood in the lobby for 10 more seconds. Then she called Victoria. "I need you to pull Gerald Fitch's relationship to any private equity group with hospitality acquisitions in their portfolio," she said. "And I need it in the next 40 minutes. Victoria, who had apparently not slept either, said Fitch. "Just the name. Like she'd landed somewhere she'd been circling. He's the buyer." The whole thing was a sale to his group. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Victoria said, "I'll have it in 30. She had it in 22. A private equity firm called Greenfield Capital Partners, registered in the Cayman Islands, with its U.S. operations address in Connecticut. Gerald Fitch appeared nowhere on the public documentation. But the registered agent was a law firm that also represented 2 other Fitch-adjacent entities that Victoria had connected through a combination of SEC filings, Delaware incorporation records, and 1 real estate transaction in 2020 where Fitch's personal name had appeared on a document it shouldn't have. "It's thin," Victoria said. "The day will have more," Clara said. "I just need enough to put the name in the room." She walked into the district attorney's office at 7:03 a.m. She had a folder under her arm and 3 hours of sleep across 2 days in her body, and the particular clarity of someone who had moved so far past exhaustion that they'd come out the other side into something that felt distantly like stillness. Senior investigator Paul Denton was 47, with close-cropped gray hair and the practiced patience of someone who conducted difficult conversations for a living. He sat across from her with two colleagues and a recorder and a legal pad, and she put her folder on the table and said, before he could begin, Gerald Fitch. He wrote the name down without reacting, which meant he'd heard it before. Somewhere in 14 months of building a case, the name had come up. Tell me what you know, he said. She told him everything. Not in the disorganized rush of someone who'd been awake for 50 hours, but in the methodical sequence she'd been assembling and reassembling since 5:14 a.m. The timeline, the structure, Fitch's position on her board, Greenfield Capital Partners, the prearranged sale price, the role of the marriage as a transfer mechanism. She laid it out like a building plan, like she was presenting a property development to a cautious investor, point by point, without drama. Denton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them that she couldn't, but understood in outline, the particular look of people who have been working a puzzle and have just been handed a piece that changes the shape of the whole thing. The Fitch connection is something our investigation hasn't fully established, Denton said carefully. James Farrell is walking through your front door at 7 a.m., she said. He'll establish it. A pause. You spoke with Farrell. He called me. Another pause. Denton looked at his legal pad. Miss Whitmore, the materials you've brought us today, the property filings, the forgery chain, the financial forensics, this is going to significantly accelerate the timeline of this investigation. He looked up. But acceleration means things are going to move fast, and not always in directions you can control. Press story that ran this morning. I know, she said. I made a calculated decision. It may complicate certain aspects of the case. It prevented a permit manipulation that would have destroyed 40% of my company's revenue base, she said. I weighed the two outcomes. I made the choice I could live with. Denton looked at her for a moment, not unfavorably. We're going to need you available, not just today. I understand. She was outside by 8:30 a.m. She called her assistant and said, board call at 10. All 7 members. Tell them it's mandatory and non-negotiable. She paused. And get me Gerald Fitch's direct number. Her assistant said, Gerald Fitch has already called twice this morning. I know, Clara said. I'll call him. She found a coffee shop 2 blocks from the DA's office and sat at a corner table and ordered a black coffee and drank half of it before she dialed Fitch's number. He answered on the second ring with the voice he always used, with her warm, measured, with the particular cadence of a man who'd spent 40 years performing expertise. Clara, I've been trying to reach you. I saw the Tribune story this morning and I'm deeply concerned. Gerald, she said, stop. He stopped. I know about Greenfield Capital Partners, she said. I know about the acquisition structure. I know you brought Vincent into this 3 years ago and the marriage was built to your specifications. She kept her voice even, the way she'd kept it even at the altar, the way she'd kept it even in the parking lot, the way she kept it even when everything around her was unstable, because being even was the only thing she had full control over. I'm telling you this because you have approximately 3 hours before the DA's office connects enough of the chain to come looking for you directly. What you do with those 3 hours is your decision. Silence. She waited. You can't prove the Greenfield connection, he said. His voice had changed. Not dramatically. Fitch was too practiced for dramatic change, but the warmth was gone. The careful warmth of 4 years of performed mentorship, and what was underneath it was something colder and more functional. The actual person. I don't need to prove it, she said. James Farrell is proving it right now, in Federal Building, in a sworn statement. She picked up her coffee cup. I'm calling you as a courtesy, because you sat at my table for 4 years, and I'm choosing to be more decent than that deserves. Another silence. Then, what do you want? Resignation from my board. In writing today. And your full cooperation with the DA's investigation when they call you, which will be before noon. She set the cup down. That's it. And if I don't, then I spend the next 6 months making sure every document, every connection, every communication between you and Vincent Devereaux and Greenfield Capital Partners is in front of every regulator and journalist and investor who will take the call. She paused. Gerald, you're 67 years old. You built a real career before this. Don't let this be the last chapter. She hung up before he could respond. She didn't know if he'd cooperate. She couldn't know. But the information was now with the DA regardless, and the resignation, if it came, would remove him from her board before the 10 o'clock call, which was what she needed. The rest was his to carry. The resignation arrived by email at 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the board call. 3 sentences, no explanation, effective immediately. She read it once, closed the email, and joined the board call. The 6 remaining board members were on the line within 2 minutes of the scheduled time. Clara had met with 4 of them through the night. The other 2, a woman named Diane Cho, who'd been on the board 3 years, and a man named Howard Blake, who'd been there since the beginning she hadn't reached. She didn't know where they stood. She told them everything she'd told the DA, abbreviated, with the same structural clarity, and she told them it straight without softening the parts that made her look like she'd been caught off guard. Because she had been caught off guard, and pretending otherwise would have been visible to anyone paying attention. She said, I built something real, and someone built a structure underneath it designed to take it from me, and I found it, and I am in the process of dismantling it. And I need you to know the full picture before the press calls you for comment, because they will be calling you before noon. Diane Cho was the first to speak when she finished. What do you need from us today? A public statement of board confidence. Today, before the market opens tomorrow. She looked at the phone. Not because I need the reassurance, because my investors and my employees need to know that the company's governance structure is intact. Done, Diane said. Howard Blake said, the 6 compromised properties. What's the realistic timeline on recovery? The forgery case is the cleanest 3 to 4 months for the legal challenge, based on Victoria Hale's assessment. Properties in distress are still operational. The ownership dispute doesn't affect day-to-day operations as long as we have injunctions in place, which we do as of this morning. Revenue impact? Minimal in the short term. Significant legal costs. She paused. I'm not going to tell you this is painless. It isn't. But the company is structurally sound, and the path forward is clear. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then I've been on this board since year 2, he said. I've watched you make hard calls before. This is harder than most. A pause. You have my confidence. The call ended at 11:15 a.m. The like green wood splitting, her being one with investor calls at noon, and she answered every never ringing with M. Spont personally, which was the only response that would actually hold. She talked for 4 hours straight, the same clear account each time, the same honest inventory of what was damaged and what was not. By 4 p.m., she'd spoken to every significant investor. By 5 p.m., 3 of them had increased their commitments. Not because the situation was comfortable, because they'd heard how she talked about it. Vincent was arrested at 2:17 p.m. She heard about it from Ethan, who heard about it from a contact at the Tribune, who'd been monitoring the federal building. She was between investor calls when the text came through, and she sat with it for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with the specific, muted feeling of watching something end that had been going on so long. It had started to feel like a permanent condition. She thought about him in his wedding suit in the parking lot, the reassessment in his eyes. The way he'd said, don't do something you can't undo, as though he were the one in a position to issue warnings. She set her phone down and went back to work. Bianca's statement had been submitted to the DA's office at 4:45 a.m. Clara hadn't spoken to her sister since she'd left the Tribeca apartment in the small hours of the morning, and she didn't speak to her now. There was too much ground between them that was still too hot to walk on. And she understood herself well enough to know that she needed more than 72 hours of distance before she could have that conversation without either burning it or performing a forgiveness she didn't yet feel. She would have the conversation. She knew that. She'd looked at her sister's face, the stripped-down face of someone who'd run out of performance, and she'd recognized something there, not innocence, not a reason to erase what had happened, but the complicated, plus imperfect reality of a person she'd grown up with, who'd made choices that had caused real damage, and who was going to have to live with those choices. The sound sex scene, The same way Clara was going to have to live with her own the 18 months of not looking too closely, the 3 years of loving someone whose full dimension she'd chosen not to examine. Nobody in this story had clean hands. The difference was what you did with that. She called Roman at 6 p.m. He picked up immediately and said, before she could begin, "You were right." She sat back in her chair. Which part? The acquisition assessment. My team had been evaluating Whitmore Estates for 7 months before the Vincent situation surfaced. The due diligence that found his documents was also due diligence on your asset value. He said it without the careful hedging she'd expected, without the managed version. Just straight. I told myself the two things were separate. They weren't. No, she said. They weren't. I should have disclosed it up front. Yes, she said. You should have. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the city was doing its evening thing, the light dropping, the streets changing registers from business to something looser. She watched it without really seeing it. The exclusivity notice, Roman said. I'm not contesting it. I know, she said. Your attorneys would have told you it was valid. They did. A pause. Clara. What I said on the phone this morning, that both things can be true. I meant it. The acquisition interest was real, and I also what I did for you in the past 48 hours. That was also real. I know, she said. That's the part I'm still working out how to hold. Another pause. Are we done? She thought about that. She thought about a man who'd shown up on her wedding steps with information that arrived. Too late, who'd been running his own calculation while also, in some imperfect, compromised, human way, choosing her side when it cost him something. She thought about the world being made of people with mixed motives and how the question wasn't purity. Nobody had that, but whether the mixture was something you could work with. Not necessarily, she said, but differently. Different how? No exclusivity clauses drafted by your attorneys, she said. No evaluation agreements that create asymmetric information access. If we ever work together on anything, it's fully disclosed, fully bilateral, and neither of us is running a side process. She paused. Can you work like that? He was quiet for a moment. It's not my default. I know, she said. It would have to be something you chose. Then I choose it, he said. She didn't know yet whether that was true. She'd been wrong about people before, in ways that had cost her more than she'd known she was paying. She wasn't going to treat Roman Callahan's word as a settled matter. But she also wasn't going to treat it as meaningless, because the world didn't run on certainty. It ran on judgment calls, and her judgment call was that this was a man capable of telling her things she didn't want to hear about himself, which was more than she could say for most people. I'll be in touch, she said, when things settle. She hung up. Gerald Fitch was contacted by the DA's office at 12:48 p.m. He cooperated. Clara didn't know the details of that cooperation and didn't ask for them. It wasn't her case to manage, and she'd learned, over 3 very long days, that the things outside her control were better released than held. The DA's investigation would run its course. The legal challenges on the 6 properties would run their course. The stories would run their course. What was hers to manage was the company, and the company was still standing. She stayed in the office until 9 that night. Not because there was still crisis work to do by that point. Most of the acute fires were contained, but because she needed to walk through every floor, speak to the people who'd worked through the week without knowing the full weight of what was happening above them. Her property managers, her design team, the administrative staff who'd answered phones all day, fielding calls from press and investors and curious parties, all of them doing their jobs while the ground shifted. She found Ethan at his desk at 8:30, his jacket off, his reading glasses low on his nose, going through a spreadsheet with the methodical attention of a man who processed uncertainty by returning to the concrete. She sat in the chair across from him, and he looked up and took his glasses off. "How are you doing?" he said. It was such a simple question that she almost didn't know what to do with it. "Ask me in a month," she said. He nodded, set his glasses on the desk. "Charleston team called this afternoon," he said. "Keisha wanted me to pass along that the server room is still locked, and nobody has tried to come back." "Good." she also said. He paused in the way he paused when something had affected him and he wasn't going to make a production of it. She said to tell you the property looks beautiful, that it always does, and that she's proud to work there. Clara sat with that for a moment. The Whitmore Charleston, 14 months of restoration, the cracked plaster she'd insisted on repairing. Rather than replacing the original heart pine floors, she'd tracked down a specialist to refinish. The garden she'd redesigned around what was already there, rather than starting over. The work that was real, underneath everything else. The thing that couldn't be forged or transferred or fraudulently amended, because it lived in the physical world in the weight of well-made things. Tell her I'll be down next week, Clara said. She left the office at 9 and went home for the first time in 3 days. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, which was to say, in the semi-organized state of a person who spent most of their time working and treated home as a place to sleep rather than a destination. She stood in the kitchen and ate crackers and drank a glass of water and felt the silence of the place settle around her. The wedding dress was still in the garment bag at the back of the office closet. She'd deal with it eventually. Not tonight. She thought about the person she'd been at 4:11 p.m. 3 days ago, standing at an altar, holding wilting peonies, about to receive a photo that would unmake a version of her life she'd been building toward for 3 years. She tried to access grief for that person, for what that person had lost, and found something complicated instead. Not grief exactly, something closer to recognition. The person she'd been at 4:11 p.m. 3 days ago had been, without knowing it, already living inside someone else's plan. The life she'd been building toward had been a construction, at least in part a fiction maintained by people who'd decided her value lay in what they could take from her. The wedding she'd been standing at the threshold of was never going to be the wedding she thought it was, and it's not admit. Losing it was not the worst thing that had happened this week. Understanding it was the best. She slept for 9 hours. Not peacefully, she dreamed in fragments, disconnected images, nothing she could hold on to in the morning. But 9 hours was 9 hours, and she woke with the specific heaviness of a body that had finally been given what it needed, and she lay in the gray morning light and breathed, just breathed, for the first time since the stone steps. The weeks that followed were not easy. She'd told her board they wouldn't be, and she'd been right. The 6 property challenges required constant legal attention, constant communication with local counsel in 4 states, constant management of the competing narratives that swirled around each filing. The DA's investigation moved at its own pace, which was slower than she wanted and more thorough than she'd expected. Vincent's network, even with him in custody, had tendrils that took time to identify and sever people who'd been in positions of operational dependency on his goodwill, who were suddenly scrambling to reposition. Bianca lost the brand. Whitmore Creative Ventures collapsed within 2 months, not because Clara moved against it, but because its entire infrastructure had been built on funding that was now frozen pending the investigation. And without that funding, and without Vincent's network, it had nothing to stand on. Bianca moved back to their mother's house in New Jersey for a period, which was the kind of thing that would once have broken Clara open, watching her sister reduced to that. Now she felt it like something at a necessary distance present real, but not hers to fix. She called Bianca 6 weeks after the wedding, not to reconcile, not to forgive, but because the distance had given her enough room to have the conversation, without it becoming a performance of either anger or grace, and because she'd decided that what she wanted from her relationship with her sister was honest, which required talking. Bianca answered on the first ring, said her name. Clara heard the specific quality of waiting in it, the waiting of someone who'd been expecting a call they didn't know how to prepare for. "I'm not calling to make anything easier," Clara said. "And I'm not calling to make it harder. I'm calling because you're my sister and I want to know how you actually are." A long silence. Then Bianca said, "I don't know how to answer that." "Then tell me the honest version instead of the answer you think I want." Another silence. Shorter. "I'm ashamed," Bianca said. "And I'm tired, and I keep thinking about the moment I sent you that photo, and I still don't completely understand why I did it." She paused. I think part of me wanted it to stop. Wanted someone to stop it. And you were the only person I trusted to actually do that. Clara sat with that for a long time. The strange, sideways logic of it, using the person you were betraying as the mechanism of your own rescue. It wasn't a justification. It wasn't even quite an explanation. But it was something honest, and honesty was the only place she and Bianca had ever really met. I can't give you a timeline on forgiveness, Clara said. I don't know when I'll be there. Maybe I will be. Maybe it looks different than forgiveness when I get to it. That's okay, Bianca said quietly. I'm not going anywhere. Neither am I, Clara said. She didn't say she loved her. She didn't have to. The call lasted another 40 minutes, and when she hung up, she felt not better but less sealed. Like a window had been opened in something that had been shut too long. The Charleston legal challenge was the first to resolve. 4 months after the wedding, a federal court in South Carolina ruled the property deed transfer invalid on the basis of documented forgery and the fraudulent notarization chain. The 51% interest transferred to D.H. Charleston LLC was reversed. Whitmore Charleston was fully hers again. She flew down the day after the ruling. She walked through the restored lobby with its original heart pine floors and its carefully replastered walls, and she stood in the garden that had been designed around what was already there, and she let herself feel the specific, solid satisfaction of something real that had survived. Keisha Drummond found her standing in the garden and said, "You came." "I said I would," Clara said. "People say things," Keisha said, with the particular practicality of someone who'd worked in property management long enough to have a realistic view of what people's words were worth. "I try to mean mine," Clara said. The Nashville and Austin challenges took longer 6 and 7 months respectively, and the outcomes were less clean. The Nashville property was recovered in full. The Austin situation required a negotiated settlement that returned 70% of the disputed interest and involved a payment she didn't fully want to make but accepted because the alternative was another 8 months of litigation that cost more in attorney fees and management distraction than the settlement amount. Not every battle was worth fighting to the last trench. She'd learned that in the first 72 hours, in the specific way, you learned things that were expensive to learn, through the body, through the exhaustion, through the understanding that winning on every front simultaneously was not possible, and that choosing which fights and which to win and which to settle was not weakness but strategy. Vincent Devereaux was indicted on 14 counts. The charges ranged from wire fraud to forgery to conspiracy to commit financial crimes, with an additional count related to the organized crime statutes that the DA's office had been building toward for 14 months. Fitch faced separate charges in a parallel investigation. The proceedings were slow and covered extensively by the press, and Clara participated in the legal process when required, and declined to make public statements about it beyond what was necessary because she'd said what she had to say the morning she walked to the microphone at the Hawthorne Estate Conservatory, and she had nothing to add. The truth does not need protection. Only lies do. She'd meant it when she said it. She still meant it. The Whitmore Estates expansion continued through all of it. Not at the pace she'd planned before the wedding. The legal costs and management demands of the challenges slowed certain projects, but steadily, property by property, built on the same foundation it had always been built on, design that was real, service that was actual, the specific integrity of work done because you believed in doing it well rather than because someone was watching. Property 15 opened in Savannah, Georgia, 10 months after the canceled wedding. She stood at the opening reception in a building that had been a failed department store 2 years earlier and was now something people came specifically to experience. And she felt the particular pride of someone who built things because building things was what they knew how to do, and who had discovered that it was enough, that it had always been enough. Roman Callahan came to the Savannah opening. Not as a partner, not as an investor. She hadn't pursued either of those structures with him. At least not yet, but as someone who'd called 3 weeks earlier and said he was in Georgia that week, and would it be inappropriate to attend the opening? She'd said it wouldn't be inappropriate. He'd said he'd see her there. He arrived toward the end of the evening, without a team, without the particular performance of important men at events designed for other important men. He walked through the space with the attention of someone actually looking at it, rather than being seen looking at it. She watched him from across the room and felt not the urgent pull of the crisis weeks when she'd needed him or suspected him in rapid alternation, but something quieter. The particular interest of seeing someone whose full dimensions she hadn't yet taken in. He found her near the garden entrance and said, "It's good work." "Thank you," she said. Not a compliment, an assessment. He looked at the space. "The way you use the original architecture. Most developers would have gutted it. Most developers don't actually like the things they build," she said. He looked at her. "And you do. I do." She looked at the room, at the people moving through it, at the original tin ceiling she'd restored at significant cost, and no financial logic, because it was beautiful and it deserved to exist. It's the only part of this work that doesn't require translation. Everything else, the finance, the legal structure, the investor relationships you have, to speak a dozen languages. But the building either works or it doesn't. Either it's a place people want to be or it isn't. That's the part I trust. Roman was quiet for a moment. "I want to talk about working together," he said. "When you're ready. No evaluation agreements. No exclusivity clauses. Your attorneys draft the structure." She looked at him. "You'd let my attorneys draft it." "I told you I would. In a phone call made at 4 a.m. when you were trying to stop me from serving you a notice. Time of day doesn't change what I said." She thought about that. She thought about the fact that he'd come to Savannah alone, without business development people, without deal structure in his briefcase. She thought about the months between that phone call and this conversation, which had been months she'd spent putting her company back together without his help and without needing it, which meant if she eventually chose to work with him, she'd be doing it from a position that was entirely her own. That was the only position she trusted anymore. "I'll have Victoria call your attorneys," she said. "Not yet, but eventually." "I can work with eventually," he said. She looked back at the room. At the Savannah evening, coming through the garden doors, warm and unhurried, the particular quality of southern light that made everything look like it had been here longer than it had. At the building that had been a failed thing and was now a real one. "Don't mistake patience for certainty," she said. "I haven't decided anything." "I know," he said. "Neither have I." She accepted that, because it was honest, and honesty was what she decided to build everything on now. Not the managed version of it, not the strategic deployment of selective truth, but the actual thing, uncomfortable and imprecise and sometimes expensive, and always, in her experience, more durable than anything built on something softer. She'd walked away from a man who'd mistaken her for a vehicle. She'd survived a man who'd mistaken her for an opportunity. She'd confronted a man who'd mistaken her for an inevitability. None of them had understood the same simple thing that had been true since the moment she'd stood at that altar and put her phone back in the pocket of her $3,000 dress and walked to the microphone. She was not the thing that happened to her. She was what she'd decided to do about it. The Whitmore Estates Board statement from that year called her a resilient leader. Press called her a survivor. Her investors called her a strong return on their confidence. Her employees called her, in the way employees called their best employers, by her first name without quite thinking about it. Keisha Drummond in Charleston called her once, 6 months after the ruling, to tell her there was a crack in the garden wall she wanted authorization to repair. Clara asked her to describe it. Keisha said it ran along the original mortar line, probably settling, nothing structural. Clara said to repair it and to use matching material so it didn't look like a patch. "You want it to look like it was never cracked?" Keisha asked. "No," Clara said. "I want it to look like it was repaired properly." There's a difference. There was. She knew the difference now, in ways she hadn't known it 3 years ago, the difference between hiding damage and addressing it, between performing wholeness and building toward it, between a life that looked good from a distance and a life that held up when you got close. She kept the pearl hair comb. Her mother had brought it to her 3 months after the wedding, arriving at her office unannounced, the way her mother arrived everywhere. A sound like green wood, particular determined woman who had decided something needed doing and had taught herself into doing it. She'd set the comb on Clara's desk and sat down across from her and said, "I want you to have it. It was always supposed to be yours." Clara had looked at the comb for a long time. Small, antique, the pearls slightly yellowed in the way that meant age rather than neglect. It had been at a canceled wedding, and before that in her mother's jewelry box, and before that on her grandmother's dressing table, and now it was on her desk, beside her coffee cup, and her legal pads, and the framed photograph of the Whitmore Charleston that she'd put up the day the ruling came through. She'd picked it up and turned it over in her hands. "Thank you," she said. Her mother had looked at her with an expression that was trying to be several things simultaneously: apology and love, and the complicated grief of a parent who understood she'd failed someone and didn't know how to measure it. "I got a lot wrong," her mother said, "with both of you. In different directions." "Yes," Clara said. "I'm trying to understand what." "I know," Clara said. "I can see that." She hadn't told her mother it was fine. It wasn't fine, but it was something they could work with over time, which was different, and she was increasingly interested in different things over time rather than resolved things right now. She put the comb in the top drawer of her desk, not because she planned to wear it soon, but because it was hers, and it had always been hers, and it had survived everything that had been done with it in between, and she thought there was something in that worth keeping close. Some months later, on a clear November morning, she was sitting at her desk reviewing the drawings for property 16, a hotel in Asheville, North Carolina, a former mill building with original brick and more stories in its walls than most cities had in their archives, when her assistant knocked and said Roman Callahan's office had sent over a document. She opened it. It was a partnership structure, clean and bilateral, drafted by her attorneys exactly as she'd asked. No exclusivity clause, full disclosure of both parties' interests and any prior evaluation activity. Compensation framework that assumed neither party needed to take from the other to make the deal work. At the bottom, in a handwritten note on plain paper attached to the front, in handwriting she recognized from the months of phone calls and crisis mornings, it said, "Whenever you're ready. No urgency." And below that, I mean the no urgency part. She read it twice, set it on her desk, looked at the Asheville drawings. She wasn't ready today. Maybe next month. Maybe in the spring, when the Nashville recovery was fully complete, and the Asheville project had moved from drawings to groundbreaking, and the legal proceedings against Vincent had cleared enough that she didn't need to reserve mental space for them. Maybe later than that. She picked up her pen and went back to the drawings. A sound like green and the November light came through the windows of the office she'd built from a single renovation project into something that was real and standing and hers in the way that nothing taken by force could ever be. And she worked because work was what she knew how to do, and because the building either worked or it didn't, and she intended, as she always had, to make it work. She would call Roman when she was ready. She had time.